Game of Thrones, The Duke of Westeros. Chapter 1. The Night of Death. The sound of shouting and horse hooves hitting the ground filled the whole world. The strong shield strike with a bloody smell was like a heavy hammer that hit his tall and fragile nose bone with a bang. A strong sour feeling suddenly emerged, but was quickly replaced by severe pain. This was not the end of the disaster. The huge force of the collision made him fall off the horse involuntarily, but because of a stirrup tied on his calf, he did not completely get rid of the maroon warhorse under him, but was dragged headfirst by the violent warhorse at a high speed. The fully armed body drooped upside down on the side of the galloping horse, and the head with a steel half-helmet rolled and wailed on the wet mud. The turbid mud smell was slightly hazy because of the damage to the nose. The eyes were also painful and could not be opened. He only felt that more than a dozen riders swarmed by his side. They might be enemies, but they might be his own people. He thought so, and the next moment he had no time to care about it. A faint swooshing sound was heard, and then the horse fell. Along with the whimpering and wailing of the horse, and the huge force brought by the heavy object falling to the ground, his legs were quickly squeezed and twisted, and finally broke from the middle with a click like chopsticks. The hysterical scream of pain stopped before it was born in his throat. Under the roar of collapse, the light chainmail on the chestnut warhorse collided violently with his silver mail. The fierce force came, and a whole row of ribs was broken. His breathing was dull because of the coverage of the giant, and at the same time, it was intermittent because of the broken neck. Everything in front of him quickly became extremely dark, weapons clashed, the black three-headed dragon flag fluttered in the wind, the rumble of the riders galloping past, screaming, laughing, howling, roaring, begging for mercy. Everything was stripped away from the battlefield. At this time, only pain was his real enemy: cheeks, neck, heart, whole body, the pain everywhere, crazy, sharp, cruel, unbearable. He lost. It was unclear when the terrifying enemy was defeated, but as the darkness was lifted, as the world changed from chaos to silence, as a sleeping little boy in the tower bedroom screamed and sat up from the feather bed and gasped, the result of failure was self-evident. The footsteps sounded from outside the room, followed by a knock on the door. "Young Master Renly, are you okay?" The voice sounded muffled through the door. "It's okay, it's just a nightmare." The suppressed hoarse voice responded to the servant, but it seemed to persuade himself. Unfortunately, the words were normal because of deliberate control, but as long as you look down, you can find that his pair of white hands and two arms that were grasping the silver-grey quilt were shaking and twitching uncontrollably. The servant outside the door obviously couldn't see this, so the sound of thumping was born again and quickly faded away. The boy called Renly didn't pay much attention to this, but kept looking down at his hands in front of him. The beautiful blue eyes still had the pain from the nightmare, but with a strange change, his hands and the heart that trembled with them quickly calmed down. Racial level, LV1. It seemed to float past his eyes, but it seemed to be just a special enlightenment. When this information was captured by his brain, he breathed a sigh of relief. Fake, yes, all fake. I'm still alive, I wasn't crushed to death by my own horse, and I'm not an adult knight. Muttering, he felt it carefully. The surging pain not long ago really disappeared, and only the illusion left in his memory was still bothering him. But it wasn't real. He comforted himself silently, but turned his head to the bedside table beside him uncertainly. On the low bedside table made of old oak were several decorative scarlet garnets and moonstones, a half-melted white wax candle, and a silver-plated round mirror from mirror across the narrow sea. As he watched, a delicate child's face was reflected in the clear mirror of the round mirror. He was only about 4 or 5 years old, with black hair and blue eyes. He looked at him quietly, and his bloodshot eyes were full of scrutiny. Another piece of information emerged. Heraldry LV6, Language LV1, Etiquette LV1. There was no such data-based ability in the dream, so he completely put his mind at ease, and everything that was ignored around him quickly emerged. This was a quiet and petite bedroom with dim light. The heavy brown door was less than 2 meters away from the bed. The fireplace with accumulated black ash was quietly embedded in the wall opposite the bed, only one leg away from the end of the bed. On the blank space above it were several exquisitely crafted light golden brocades. The surface of the satin was embroidered with the crown and stag symbol of the Baratheon family and some of the family's past achievements. The Baratheon family was an ancient and honorable family, one of the 8 great feudal nobles of the Targaryen dynasty, so it was not difficult to imagine how exaggerated the paintings on the brocade were. But Renly did not keep his eyes on it for long. After a glance, he moved his eyes to the narrow window on the left. A beam of sunlight shone from the glass of the window, slender and bright, illuminating a nearby floor, but also covering a floating dust that was invisible to the naked eye. At this time, he was inside the towering tower of his family's Storm's End, so high that he could see only a hazy sky beyond the light except for the sunlight. But a strange fragrance was wafting in from the window. It was strange, like the scent of books formed by the blending of ink and parchment, but it also had a faint smell of burning. So Renly lifted the silver silk quilt, put on the shoes on the floor beside the feather bed, and walked towards the window in a thin black velvet pajamas. Sparse and trivial sounds continued to sound as he walked. It was the rush mat on the floor that was causing trouble. Usually Renly always disliked that this thing was too noisy when walking, but at this time he had basically ignored it and focused all his attention on his goal. The window embedded in the wall was not low, and he was not tall enough to reach it, so he moved a long bench nearby and climbed up, and then pushed the narrow square window open. With a creaking sound, the breeze that was blocked outside blew in through the window, the sound of seagulls, the salty sea breeze blew up his short charcoal black hair, and the coldness brought by the wind caused goosebumps on his fair arms. Looking across the courtyard under the tower in a forest of sacred trees, the morning mist covered the sea outside the city wall, blurring the vast ocean scene. Farther away, the hazy shadows of ships slowly rippled in the depths of the fog, not just one or two, but dozens or even hundreds. They were in neat formation, surrounding the seaside castle on the towering cliff from the sea, looking like a group of black knights quietly hidden in the fog, riding their horses with high spirits, aiming their spears at the enemy, and waiting for the horn to sound before launching a charge. The target was the Wind's End Castle. The head of the Baratheon family, Robert Baratheon, his eldest brother, had previously launched a rebellion against the royal Targaryen family. As a result, they were hit hard by their good neighbors to the west, the Tyrell family, the Lords of the Reach, who were loyal to the royal family, and were forced to leave their own territory and disappear without a trace. The family's Storm's End was also besieged by the soldiers of the Reach. However, they have been besieging for more than half a year, but there is still no movement. Maester Cresson, who taught Renly, claimed that Storm's End had never been captured for thousands of years. The Tyrell family obviously knew this, so they only besieged but did not attack, hoping that the supplies in the castle would run out and starve them to death. Renly was not sure whether this statement was correct or not, and he was not interested in delving into it, because if nothing unexpected happened, the castle would stand firm until the last moment, until Robert Baratheon smashed the heir of the Targaryen dynasty to death with a hammer and successfully usurped the Iron Throne. Of course, he was not sure about this. Although this was a familiar world, no one could guarantee whether it would develop according to the plot in his memory. The tower was tall, but due to the location of the bedroom, Renly could only see the seaside at this time, and there was nothing to see there. So he shifted his gaze. There were faint shouts of soldiers behind the tower. It might be daily training, or someone might be giving a speech. He stretched his neck and looked down. There were two figures talking face to face in the courtyard at the root of the building. The distance was too far to hear any words. Due to the height, they looked like two small ants, one black and one grey, not very noticeable. However, Renly could clearly identify who they were. Maester Cresson of Storm's End, and the coach Gavin Wilde. Maester Cresson taught him some necessary knowledge for the noble children every day, and it was not long before the teaching time. But Renly's blue eyes were looking at the coach of Storm's End standing opposite the maester. The smell that smelled like books but also a bit burnt came from this person. The distance was too far, so it was actually difficult to identify at the moment, but the smell had already existed. As the third son of the Baratheon family, although he was still young, sometimes Renly needed to eat in the same hall with the coach, so he was very sure of this. So the question is, would a normal person emit such a strong, special fragrance that transcends such a high level? Or is it abnormal? Is it really Coach Wilder? Leaning against the window, he raised his hand and touched his nose, as if the sourness and pain still existed. The boy pursed his lips. He didn't know how he entered this very cruel world in his impression, and he was reincarnated as a Baratheon. Many things before becoming Renly were also quite vague, but the abnormality was obvious at the moment. The inexplicable fragrance, the unique data that emerged faintly as he looked at it, and most importantly, this was not the first time he had that kind of dream. Chapter 2. When Maester Cresson finished talking to others and climbed up the stone ladder out of breath, Renly had already left the bedroom and was waiting in the maester's residence not far from his room. He no longer looked like he was wearing pajamas just now. but put on formal clothes. The black woolen trousers were cut half a year ago and were a little too small for him, so that when he stood up to greet her, some of his ankles were unknowingly exposed. Maester Cresson didn't notice this. Instead, he praised the boy's velvet top which fit him well, but the color was not suitable. The color was the same as the trousers. Coupled with the short black hair, the overall look was perfect. Black, looks slimmer. Being able to dress yourself without having to bother a servant is beyond criticism. But kid, don't forget that you are not yet 5 years old. The right thing to do is to accept help and advice from your servants. The maester ended the greeting with these words, and then sat down at a small table with a partition by the window in the room, holding a heavy parchment book. Renly sat opposite him, glanced curiously at the books spread out on the table with his clear eyes, and then blinked. It's time to learn heraldry again. It's to learn the history of noble families, identify common language vocabulary, and learn about the coats of arms of the lords. The old bachelor who sat firmly replied, turned the book to a certain page at the back with his hands covered with age spots, and carefully smoothed out the wrinkles on the page. He officially started teaching. The layout of the rooms in the tower is basically the same, but the windows in Maester Cresson's room are larger than those in Renly's bedroom. Sufficient sunlight shines in from the windows on their sides, making the small and elegant pages on the surface of the old yellow parchment book shine. The exquisite black common language characters are embellished with a sacred aura, and the heraldic patterns carefully painted on the upper left corner or center of the page add to this aura. The children's voices were pure and sweet, and the old man's words were kind and steady. Except for the voices of an old man and a young man, there was no other noise in the room. Silent metal utensils and messy glass jars quietly dotted the surroundings. On a desk not far away was a half-open black parchment book with a quill inserted in the ink bottle. The unique smell emitted from it made Renly faint. There is an illusion that it seems to be some kind of delicacy. There used to be a group of black ravens here, and they were very noisy. However, as the siege unfolded, most of them had been released to ask for help, and the few that had not been released gradually disappeared. Renly speculated that the old maester might have given them all to the fat chef in the city. The lunches had been smelling like bird droppings lately. It is worth mentioning that there is currently no breakfast or dinner in Storm's End. Food is scarce and everyone here has only one meal to eat. A silver seahorse on a sea green background. House Velaryon of Tideshed. Family motto. Old, true, and brave. Their history. Origined from the demise of the free fortress of Valyria, it was once a dragon-riding family. It was an ally of the royal Targaryen family and followed the Targaryens to move to the continent of Westeros. The best members of the Valyrian family in history. The character is Lord Corlys Velaryon, known as the Sea Serpent 200 years ago. His fleet once sailed to the known world. Maester Cresson is already an old man in his 60s, but his body still looks strong. Only his back under the grey woolen robe is slightly rickety, but this does not affect his energy. When he speaks, his grey eyes, the brown eyes, were bright and seemed to be full of wisdom. At each turn of the page, the old maester would explain something, and then ask Renly to repeat what he had just said. Renly didn't think he was very smart, but he had the mind of an adult, so he could learn these things relatively quickly. At the same time, he didn't know if it was an illusion, but he always felt that his memory was particularly good today, and the expression of the old man opposite him became more and more satisfied. I should really suggest that Robert send you to study in Old Town. Yes, I should, if he were here. Boy, you are born to be a maester, and you may even have a chance to become a doctor. Renly had no interest in being a doctor in the Middle Ages, especially since he knew that bachelors in the citadel were not allowed to marry and have children, so he did not answer the question and pointed at the end of the book hanging under the horizontal bar. The dead brown deer changed the subject. Does this hunter family have a grudge against us? The child's unique clear voice was full of doubts. Why do you say that? The old bachelor asked strangely. After speaking, he looked at the coat of arms again before he realized what he was saying, and couldn't help but laugh. It's just a coincidence. Besides, the Baratheon deer is black, not brown. Renly said oh, and then suddenly asked, what about the black dragon and the red dragon? Black dragon and red dragon. There are 3-headed dragons, one black and one red. The red one is the emblem of the Targaryen family, I know. Which family is the black one? This question made the old bachelor stunned. 3-headed black dragon. Yes, 3 black dragons on a red background. That was the sigil of House Blackfire. A noble bastard designed it. It was taken from the inversion of the crest of House Targaryen. But the last Black Fire died on the stepstones 21 years ago. The King's Guard, dauntless Sir Barristan, killed him with his own hands. After speaking, the old bachelor asked strangely, "This book does not record the Black Fire family. Where did you see this coat of arms?" "I forgot which book I saw it in." "Lying is not a good habit, kid, you have to tell the truth." "I'm telling the truth." It's hard for a 4-year-old to fool people as skillfully as Renly, and he still looks serious. However, Maester Cresson, who had some understanding of his character, was not fooled. "I don't think there's a book in this castle that I haven't read, kid," he emphasized, "and none of them, unsurprisingly, contain any mention of the Black Fires." The Maester's expression was meaningful, but unfortunately his words did not reveal the boy's flaws. "Okay, Master Cresson, I confess, I remember which book it is." Renly lowered his head, as if full of shame, but it was the book in Stannis's room. "He didn't know, I sneaked in." As he spoke, he added a little timidly, "Master Cresson, you must not tell him that he has such a bad temper. He is your second brother, kid, you don't have to be afraid of him." The old bachelor sighed, "And he's actually not bad-tempered. He's just a little bit arrogant." "Yes, that's true. Stannis, the second son of the Baratheon family, is a withdrawn person. He is the most indifferent among the 3 brothers. Except for the attendants, no one dares to approach his room under normal circumstances, and the old bachelor is no exception. So the topic of lying has been skipped." However, Renly was not complacent about this. Instead, he seemed a little absent-minded during the rest of the teaching because of the information he had just learned. "Why did I dream about the war between the Red Dragon and the Black Dragon, and then be killed by a black fire that disappeared long ago?" he wondered. "In other words, why do you dream that you become another person and are killed by a knight of the Black Fire family?" He has never understood the Black Fire family, and his foresights about the current world are only hazy impressions in his mind, and there is no so-called Black Fire in them. If you don't know anything, how can you dream about it? Besides, it's not just once. What is the motto of House Lannister in the Westerlands? The tone of the question coming from the other side was gentle and normal, which did not make Renly much wary, so he subconsciously answered, "Lannister must be in debt." He couldn't speak any more mid-sentence. He blinked and the boy looked a little innocent. "Listen to my roar. In the city, many trainee bachelors have fallen into this trap. They always hope to find some more in-depth knowledge from books, but they don't bother to remember simple common sense." Renly was a little embarrassed when he heard this, but the old maester did not dwell on this and waved his hand. "The siege has deprived us of news from the outside world, but Robert has proven his bravery at Summerhall. Besides, even if the war goes against us, this issue should not be your consideration. My child, you have talent and a far-reaching mind. He is more mature than ordinary children, but it's hard for me to say whether this is an advantage or a flaw. I watched your second brother grow up. He is taciturn and withdrawn. He is a person who lacks childhood. But as for you, although you always laugh, but more than him." Suddenly he seemed to realize that he shouldn't say these words in front of a 4-year-old child, so he closed his mouth apologetically. But there was still a trace of sadness and worry on that old wrinkled face. Maester Cresson is a good man. Renly knew this. Bachelors born in the city have always remained neutral in politics. They serve the castle, not a certain lord. So even if Storm's End Castle was captured, his life would not be in danger. But the old maester remained loyal to House Baratheon and feared for the house and every member of its family without reservation. "I'm just hungry." He tried to change the subject. "This is a lie, but it is not a lie." He was indeed hungry, but his adult thinking prevented Renly from showing it because it wasn't time to eat yet. The bachelor opened his mouth when he heard this, and then sighed. "You know the rules set by Stannis, and there is indeed not much food. Good boy, be patient. After we finish studying these last few pages, it will probably be time to eat. Maybe I should consider telling the kitchen to prepare some good food. Look, you have finished studying another book. Isn't this something worth celebrating?" Renly couldn't agree more with this sentence, but it also reminded him of something about to happen in his memory, or in other words, someone who was about to come. He had no idea what Robert Baratheon had done to overthrow the Targaryens, nor the siege of Storm's End. The only person he knows anything about is a guy named the Onion Knight. I remember correctly, that person was the one who took the risk to bring in a boatload of onions during the siege, solved the famine in the city, and was named a knight afterwards. It can't be just onions. How can you be full with onions? What else can there be? Are there a few boxes of bacon? It would be better if there are a few capons. When will he come? Renly would think of the onion knight every time he went hungry, but the food he expected would be different, but soon he had no time to care. As the old maester finished talking about the last page of the heraldry book, as he coughed when his withered hands closed the book, and with the harsh sound of the chair sliding on the floor when he stood up, the boy who stood up at the same time as the maester suddenly felt his heart beating rapidly. Speeding up, even the violent noise suppressed all surrounding sounds to a very weak level. At the same time, his brain was unusually clear, and the knowledge of heraldry flowed through his mind involuntarily, and finally all of it was condensed and hidden away. Renly had an epiphany, so he turned his head and looked at a mirror placed on the edge of a long shelf table not far away. The blurred mirror surface stained with dried bird droppings reflected a child's face with wide eyes. Also, a line of information that had never appeared before, like a mist, emerged. Heraldry level increased to LV7, derived characteristics, psychic heraldry. Chapter 3. The goodies that the old maester ordered the kitchen to prepare were not that good: a small portion of barley bread, a corner of hardened cheese, a shrunken green apple, a small portion of turnips cooked in butter, and a bowl of thick broth with a strange fishy smell. What kind of meat is this? A loud question came from the side. On the left, a round-faced fat man in a light yellow thin shirt was staring at the thick soup in front of him with his dark eyes, and his butt was moving restlessly on the bench. Is it rat meat again? Another thin child with golden red hair on Renly's right was originally holding a table dagger to pick up a few peas floating in the thick soup. When he heard this, his movements suddenly hesitated, and he looked at the old man sitting across the long table with suspicion. This is certainly not rat meat. In the small room, Maester Cresson looked at the three fat and thin boys in front of him with a kind look. There are no more rats to catch in the castle. The little fat boy in yellow clothes is from the Ethmond family of Greenstone Castle. The long-dead mother of the three Baratheon brothers is from this family. Because they are of the same age, he was sent to be Renly's playmate a year ago. The other thin boy with golden red hair is from the Dondarrion family of Black Harbour. He happened to be in the city when Storm's End was besieged, so naturally he couldn't go out. They are all vassal descendants of the Baratheon family of the Lord of Stormland, and they are also very good children considered by Maester Cresson. Due to Renly's special aloofness, during the siege, the Maester would create opportunities for them to get together and play whenever there was a chance, and this is an example. However, if Master Renly needs it, I can arrange an experienced nun for you to teach you the etiquette on the table. The two children followed the words of the old maester and turned their attention to the black-haired boy, and found that he had just woken up from a dream and retracted his gaze from the fat man beside him, and blinked his eyes innocently. I'm sorry, he stuck out his tongue and said, but it looks interesting. The emblem of the Estermont family is a greener turtle on a green background, which usually attracts his attention, but the reason now is naturally not simple. It's just that this cannot be told to others. I think so too. The little fat man immediately patted the family emblem embroidered on the chest of his clothes and said loudly, they are not only beautiful, but also edible. When the tide comes, we can't eat them all. My grandfather said that as long as we eat more, the sons we give birth to will sooner or later be like them in groups. After saying that, he suddenly thought of a problem, so he turned sideways and looked at the boy opposite Renly over, disgusting Beric, your family's Black Harbour must not always thunder, otherwise how could you be the only one? The family emblem of the Dondarrion family is a forked purple lightning on a black background, and several flashing four-pointed stars. That's because my father died early. The other rolled his eyes, but didn't pay much attention to him. Instead, he lowered his head and stared at his thick soup, frowning and asked, if this soup is not made of mice, what else could it be? It's cat meat. Before the old man spoke, Renly, who was no longer distracted, answered casually, the horses and mules in the castle have been eaten up long ago, and even the hunting dogs and hawks raised by my eldest brother are no exception. Master Cresson's crows have been missing for a while, and the group of people outside won't even let us in a fly. After all the calculations, there can't be anything else except those black cats used to catch mice. Smart? The maester nodded in agreement, so the two children breathed a sigh of relief and started to eat after obtaining the maester's consent. But Renly declined. He didn't forget that he had touched the cats in the castle with his own hands not long ago, and because of the memory that did not belong to this world, he was naturally resistant to eating cat meat. "Can I give my broth to Jomi?" Jomi is Renly's personal servant, who is responsible for taking care of his daily life. The old scholar was a little stunned when he heard this. Why give it to him? "No matter how full I am, I can't help guard the castle, but Jomi has the ability." Renly answered seriously. "Only children will admit that they are picky eaters. Experience has shown that a hypocritical child can always achieve his goals easily, and this moment is no exception. Even some extra gains have been made." The old man was very pleased with this, and the golden red-haired Beric Dondarrion next to him was even more thoughtful when he heard this. Then he pushed away the thick soup in front of him, stood up, and didn't even plan to eat other food. "I will also give mine to Lord Stannis, he will need them more than us." He declared so, as if he realized some virtue from Renly's words, with a serious face. The scholar persuaded him for a long time, and this guy reluctantly sat back, lowered his head and ate the coarse bread reluctantly. "If you don't want to eat, can you give them all to me?" The little fat man asked expectantly, but no one paid attention to him. Renly was very hungry, so although some changes in himself attracted him deeply, it did not affect his ability to fill his stomach. He successfully gave away the cat soup, but he accepted all the other food. Rough barley bread, sweet and bitter cheese, and butter-cooked turnips that looked like soup. Turnips are delicious. This radish-like thing is commonly known as kohlrabi in my memory, but after processing, it tastes like potatoes, soft and delicious, with a long lingering flavor. The light milky aroma of butter cooked into the turnips lingers in the nose and mouth with this lingering feeling, and it refuses to dissipate for a long time. It was not until he ate his share of the wilted apple that the lingering fragrance quietly dissipated from his lips and teeth, making him sigh with regret. The lunch did not last long, but the old maester hurriedly left because someone summoned him. He did not return for a long time. The three children who were not supervised were a little confused after eating. The thin bamboo-like Barry suggested going to the courtyard to see if there were any knights training, and the fat boy Alan thought it was more attractive to go to the Godswood to play the castle game, but Barry thought there were ghost faces on the trees in the Godswood, which was scary, so he insisted on not going. Renly did not comment on this, but stared at the green turtle on the front of the fat man. In the eyes of others, the emblem embroidered on the robe is normal, just a dark green turtle lying on a green background, made of dyed silk thread. But in his eyes, this turtle can move. Originally, it grasped the ground with its four limbs and did not move, but after the change, it struggled to get rid of the seemingly heavy turtle shell on its body, squatted down like a naked little man, and the turtle face was flushed, leaving a little black mark on the green ground, and then got into the clothing again, and continued to return to the original lying motionless appearance. In this way, the originally normal emblem became a dark green turtle lying on a green background, and a small black dot with an imaginative shape next to it. If you stop observing at this time, there will be no new changes, but when Renly continues to watch, everything that just happened will repeat itself again in a wonderful way. Crawling, kicking off the turtle shell, squatting, and the second small black dot appears. Retracting into the turtle shell, crawling, kicking off. The lines embroidered on the lapel kept wriggling and rolling, as if it was a short pantomime made of dies and lines, which was played repeatedly, and the people who watched it became more and more confused. Until the little guy who was stared at by him felt a little uncomfortable. "I will invite you to eat turtles on the Isle of Ethman someday, I will do this," Fatty told Renly loudly, but he was faced with the other party's inquiring eyes. "Did you not wipe your butt?" This made the little fat man stunned, and then his round face turned red quickly, his voice became less loud, and he became stuttering. "Nonsense, nonsense. Ethman's Aaron always wipes his butt when he poops, if you don't believe it, go ask Pate." Pate was a servant who took care of Aaron's daily life, but in a hurry, the little fat man obviously forgot that his servant was a mute. Even a fool could see that he was lying, but Renly had no interest in exposing this guy, because his mind had already drifted elsewhere. Psychic emblem. He thought about his special ability thoughtfully and didn't say anything for a while. The little fat boy was relieved when he saw this, but then he found that the thin bamboo pole was winking at him, so he glared and shouted, "You annoying Bailey, why are you looking at me? Don't call me annoying, you are the annoying one. Call me, I will call you. Then I will call you stinky ass Alan." They were arguing, but they found that the black-haired boy who had been very quiet suddenly turned around and walked out of the house. "Renly, where are you going?" The thin bamboo pole asked hurriedly when he saw this, and got rid of the fat man's angry eyes. I'm going to find Coach Wilder. The other party replied. Chapter 4. Gavin Wilde, the trainer of Storm's End, is a middle-aged man in his 30s with fluffy brown hair. He wears boiled leather armor and rough breeches. When he followed the scent and found him, the man was standing there. On the edge of the stable, there was a conversation with 3 well-armed knights. But when Renly ran over with his 2 friends and personal servants, they stopped the conversation appropriately. Good afternoon, Sir Gavin. Renly spoke first. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but he felt that the other party's blue eyes were a little wary when looking at his group. The 3 knights also nodded and turned around to leave. Barry and Aaron also said hello to the coach, who responded politely and asked about the purpose of their visit. So Xiao Zugin couldn't wait to speak. We want to ask you about the ways of chivalry. Before this sentence received a response, Fatty Island rushed to speak loudly. There is also a coat of arms. Master Crescent has never told us about a coat of arms that is divided into 4 parts like yours. In fact, the old maester taught these things, but he never went to listen to them. This guy initially studied with Renly for a while, then lied about having a headache and quit. Renly said nothing, for everything he wanted to say had been said. So he simply said nothing and looked up at the heraldic symbol embroidered on the chest of Professor Wilder. Although he is a retainer of the Baratheon family, unlike the servants, Gavin Wilder is of noble origin, so he can keep the Wilder family in his own personal coat of arms, 4 blue stripes on a gold background. Green maelstrom. Knight. Coat of arms. The middle-aged instructor rubbed his cheek after hearing this, and said vaguely, the rule is that you are not allowed to receive preliminary knight training until you are 7 years old, so boys, go back and forth wherever you come from. Now it's not time yet. As for the coat of arms? This is the first time I heard someone ask me about it. His voice was a little impatient, and he seemed to want to turn around and leave after he finished speaking, so Renly asked appropriately, then why is it you? What? The instructor stopped and looked down at him. Even though they were children, he obviously couldn't ignore Renly's problem like he ignored the other 2. Master Crescent said that the instructors responsible for training knights in the castle are usually experienced old knights. Renly blinked and said, the expression on his face fully demonstrated the meaning of the word Tong Yan Wuji in his memory. But you look very young. That's because I personally defeated 3 experienced old knights like you call them. The middle-aged coach replied proudly. Sir Tito Swan of Stonehelm, Morton Cullen of Night Song, and the bastard Cedric Storm of Bronzegate City. Although they are clever in their methods, my sword is better than theirs. I know the bastard Sedak. Xiao Zugin was surprised when he heard this. He once fought 3 Dornish bandits alone in the border area and killed them. You can actually defeat him. He is a difficult guy, but yes, I defeated him. The coach waved his hand, looking unconcerned. How did you defeat him? I saw him at a martial arts tournament in Sen Shutton. He was. Renly had already ignored their conversation, because the close contact with the middle-aged coach made the already strong and unique fragrance become a bit overpowering, especially when the man opened and closed his mouth to speak. This naturally aggravated his desire to find out. However, he had been studying this for a long time in the past, but he still had no clue, so now he focused all his attention on his newly acquired ability, the ability to raise his head and concentrate. The way he stared at the other person's chest seemed to be listening attentively. At first, nothing special happened to his gaze, but when 4 or 5 seconds passed, the surrounding environment suddenly became a little unreal and hazy, and even the sound of conversation seemed much weaker. It seemed that silently, a special channel was established between Crest and Renly. As this channel formed, the originally static vortex pattern gradually changed. Faintly, the 4 vortexes seemed to be alive, spinning rapidly towards the separation point in the center of the coat of arms, with blue and green colors mixed. After stirring, all the dye colors that formed the vortex disappeared, leaving only a blank golden heraldry base. The conversation continued. Beric Dondarrion, who aspired to become a knight, was very interested in the middle-aged instructor responsible for teaching martial arts in the castle, and questions kept coming. The fat island on the side was not to be outdone, but he was not as old as Barry, and he might not pay much attention to knights. Naturally, he couldn't ask some questions that he thought were very profound, so he simply used the coat of arms. Frequent interruptions on this topic. Why a whirlpool? Perhaps the gods in heaven will know why. You must understand, boy, that House Wilder was an ancient house before Aegon's conquest. Then why are there 4 whirlpools? Because I am the 4th eldest child in the family. How did it get on the clothes? Is this, using a needle and thread? Or a wooden machine? That's all. Boy, stop asking me questions like this. Do I look like a bachelor? Could that be painted on? Draw it on? How is this possible? I heard that the Dornish people are very good at drawing things on their clothes. The Dornish are good at raising sheep. The coach sneered and waved his hand. Okay, kids, that's enough. You should understand that I'm not an idler. He turned and walked away, leaving 2 little guys who were surprised by his words and a black-haired boy who seemed to be thinking about something. The Dornish actually raise sheep. Fatty stared at the back of the middle-aged coach with wide eyes, and the expression on his face seemed to have discovered a new world. Although he was still young, people in this world were generally precocious. Even if they didn't fully understand some things, they knew a little bit. Why do they do that? Why so many whys? The Dornish do everything and can do anything. Dondarrion, whose territory is located on the border of the Stormlands and is a neighbor of Dorne, has more say in this matter. When talking about the Dornish, he also looks angry and contemptuous. Among the 7 kingdoms, the old name in ancient times, Stormland and Dorne have always been enemies, and some nobles on the border of Stormland are even more hostile to Dorne. In recent years, the 2 sides have eased somewhat, but in the past, especially when the 7 kingdoms were not unified and were still 6 kingdoms, there were countless tragedies on the border. It is not difficult to imagine how they would slander each other in normal times. It's so hot in Dorne, is there any sheep? Renly, who came to his senses, kindly reminded his friends. He couldn't help yawning while speaking, so that his voice seemed a little vague, but it didn't prevent the 2 children from understanding what he was saying. Yes, Dorne is a desert, and there is no grass at all. What do sheep eat? Fatty came to his senses and looked at Beric with a suspicious look, as if questioning his pretense of knowing just now. This, who cares about such a boring question? Skinny Bamboo Pole blushed a little. He didn't think about it carefully. When he heard the Dornish people, he subconsciously started to pour dirty water on them. Besides, sheep have so much wool that they will die of heat if they stand on the sand. Fatty kept nagging at this question. Maybe they will complain about their Dornish masters before they die. Why do you keep me? Don't you know that I don't eat sand? Are you doing this on purpose? Can you shut up? Do you keep me in the sand on purpose so that you can easily frame me? Children are always talkative. Renly listened to their arguments and led the way towards the tower. The coach left, so he naturally couldn't continue to observe, and perhaps because he had used this ability several times in a short period of time, he actually felt a little sleepy at the moment. However, although his attention couldn't help but be scattered, his body instinctively wanted to let him lie down and rest for a while, but he still tried to concentrate on the phenomenon he had just seen, or the omen. 4 disappearing whirlpools? Disappeared, or drilled out. What does this mean? Renly kept thinking along the way, his little face wrinkled. Although he didn't achieve his desired goal, he was not disappointed because there were no clues in many previous contacts, he was able to treat this matter calmly. However, it's not that he didn't gain anything. Thinking about everything he saw before and considering the current situation in the castle, Renly's eyes flashed with doubt. So when he returned to the tower, he wrote a line of words on the scraps of parchment he usually practiced with an unfamiliar technique, and then called the short servant behind him and whispered, "Jomi, help me pass it to Master Cresson." Chapter 5. Coach Wilder was caught. When the news came, Renly was in his small room, trying to read on his own without the help of his old maester. Although his vocabulary was insufficient and his reading was somewhat stumbling, he was still able to continue reading the book titled Ruby and Steel in his hand. The book Ruby and Steel tells the story of a group of female warriors outside Westeros who wear rubies on their faces. They are a very strange race. His vocabulary was even stranger, causing Renly serious trouble. But he still insisted on doing it. The heraldry he had been studying had basically come to an end after the last lecture. The old bachelor claimed that his knowledge of it was no weaker than that of ordinary bachelors. If you want to learn other knowledge, you are not yet old enough. In other words, what Renly needs to learn is not something that the old bachelor can teach at will. He has to ask Renly's guardian, that is, the Baratheon family. The current head of the house, Robert Baratheon, agreed. However, that person was not in the castle at this moment. So currently the only thing Renly can continue to learn is language. He didn't resist this, after all, he understood that language was also a skill in his attribute column, and he was obviously very interested in his special golden finger, or the strange abilities that extended from it. However, when the servant Xiaomi came to interrupt him, he still subconsciously breathed a sigh of relief, then put down the obscure crimson parchment in his hand and repeated what the servant had just said. Master Wilder, together with Sir John, Sir Norton and Sir Ralph, planned to secretly open the city gate and surrender, but Stannis discovered it. Yes, Master. The short and fat Xiaomi nodded quickly. We mean, yes, they have been imprisoned in the dungeon by Lord Stannis. Xiaomi is a brown-haired servant in his 40s with a simple face. He is wearing a sleeveless leather jacket and coarse trousers. He is also carrying a cloth basket with a faint fragrance in his hand. At this time, he put the basket in his hand on the shelf table and said happily, Lord Stannis also specially ordered the kitchen to bring food to the young master. Look, there are sea pigeon pie, oatcakes, pea porridge, and even there's also a baked apple. As he spoke, he glanced curiously at the black-haired boy who was bowing his head in thought, but did not ask anything. The Master of Storm's End was captured, and Master Renly received food. There was obviously a connection between them. The smell of food wafted away, tempting Renly's already harshly treated stomach to become even hungrier. But at this time, he didn't pay much attention to the food next to him, but thought about the consequences of this information. 5 days have passed since he made the report, and nothing special happened during this period. Renly originally thought that he might be too sensitive, but he didn't want to suddenly learn such news. In fact, he was not sure that the coach would do something outrageous. He just felt that it was possible, so what he notified was only some more uncertain and scattered information. I accidentally overheard the conversation between Captain Gavin and Sir John, Sir Norton and Sir Ralph. They seemed to be talking about Stannis. I also heard the words be careful and be vigilant. I think there may be some secrets here, Maester Cresson, and I think you need to know them. This is the content on the note. The purpose is to hope that they can be alert to this. At the same time, even if they misunderstand the coach, what he said will not cause him too much trouble. After all, a gamble, a sneaky meal, or maybe a laziness during patrol can also cause the instructor to be more sneaky. Just looking at it now. I'm going to find Master Cresson. Let's put the food away first. He stood up suddenly and hurried out without waiting for a response, leaving the somewhat dazed servant standing there. The old maester was easy to find. He was old and would not leave his maester's room in the tower, which was only a few steps from Renly's chamber, unless Stannis summoned him. When he saw the old man, he was sitting behind his desk piecing together a broken parchment map. Renly's visit didn't make him raise his head, but his words contained a hint of smile. Stannis blamed me for wasting food on you at first, but it turns out that even children will play an unexpected role at some point. I'm going to visit Coach Wilder in the dungeon. Renly said straight to the point, with a serious look on his face. He obviously couldn't get close to the dungeon on his own, even if he was the third direct son of the Baratheon family. Visit? The old man's hands paused as he puzzled the map. There is nothing to visit. He is a traitor. He wants to betray us. He helped me. Renly said sincerely, Robert's hounds are very fierce. He helped me fight them off that time. Your brother's hunting dogs will only wag their tails when they see you. The old man exposed his lie without raising his head. Besides, your second brother is not allowed to visit the traitor, not anyone. Do you want to eat him? When the old man heard this, his hand holding the map couldn't help but tremble. He looked up at Renly, his eyes widened, and his old face seemed to be full of shock. Tell me, kid, who told you that? Recently, the food supply has become less and less, and the smell from the kitchen has become very weak. Even the coarse bread eaten by the stable boy is moldy. Not long ago, I heard someone said that we would not be able to survive the next one. Moon. Who said that? The old man's words contained seriousness, but Renly did not accept this. You want to eat him, he repeated firmly. It's just, this. The old man hesitated, as if he was ashamed of it. However, Renly did not want to force him to continue talking on this topic, because that was not his purpose. Take me to see him. The black-haired boy reiterated solemnly. He usually behaved in a swaying and unruly manner, but at this time he rarely showed a hint of edge. I want to see him. The old man was silent for a moment after hearing this, and finally took a deep look at this unusually precocious child. Don't worry about the crazy things that traitor may say. He warned, put down the fragments of the map in his hand, picked up the crooked stick leaning on the bookshelf next to him, and took the lead to walk out of the door. Seeing this, Renly followed the opponent obediently without saying a word. The dungeon is located under the tower and can be accessed directly along the building. As they walked forward, a manservant sweeping the stairs greeted them. 3 washerwomen carried a pile of clothes to make way for an old man and a young man. The 2 Baratheon soldiers guarding the door of the tower walked silently and watched them. Lee, a crazy jester named Patchface, was jumping around in the courtyard, and suddenly ran away crying after leaving the 2 of them, which seemed very baffling. I'm still not sure whether saving him was the right choice. The old man commented on this, which may also have the purpose of breaking the dull atmosphere. The fool is a wretch. Your uncle never liked him before he died, but Stannis cares about him very much. Yes, even though he doesn't show it, I can feel it. No wonder, alas. Renly didn't pay much attention to all this, or even listen carefully to the old man's words. At this time, his mind was basically focused on the upcoming meeting, and he was also full of doubts about it. I have tried so many times before but failed to find any clues. Can I do it this time? But if you don't go, you won't have much chance in the future. Why does he smell so good? Fragrant. Do we really need to eat him? It tastes delicious, it seems to make sense. He felt a little nauseous for a moment, so when he saw the target in the dark dungeon face to face, he always felt that he couldn't bear to look at the target. Under the light of the torch, his blue eyes couldn't help but glance at the dirty oil overflowing from his forehead. Sweat. Help me. Maester Cresson, help me. The former Master of Storm's End cried and howled as soon as he saw the 2 of them, or rather the old Maester, and there were also sounds of begging for mercy coming from several cells next to him, so that the dark dungeon corridor was filled with chaotic noises for a while. The old Maester did not respond, but held Renly's hand with a little force, as if to signal him to be alert. His other hand held a torch soaked in oil and wrapped in cloth. The dim yellow light illuminated the originally dark place, and also made the originally handsome face in the dirty cage look particularly embarrassed. I was just impulsive, and I'm still very hungry. Gods are merciful, Master Cresson, please forgive me. Coach Wilder, who had fluffy brown hair, held the thick wooden railings of the cage with both hands and knelt there with a snot from his nose. He cried and begged with tears, but only a pair of old eyes full of pity silently responded to him. So he looked at the other short being staring at him outside the cage. Master Renly, go and beg your second brother, tell him not to do this. Tell him that he doesn't want to become a monster, yes, that's all. Go. Please, just. He stopped abruptly before he finished speaking, because just as he was talking urgently, something suddenly fell out of his mouth and fell into the dirty straw in front of him. You made the person involved sound very vague at the end of his words. Looking down, they seemed to be 3 dentures embedded in wooden brackets. Under the light of the torch, they exuded a dull light yellow color. The noise stopped, and the dungeon corridor became a little quiet for a while. Renly looked at the 3 dentures in the haystack, then looked at the owner of the dentures, his eyes widening for a moment. This seemed to make the other party angry, so he stopped begging and instead stood up and cursed loudly. 7 hells, tell the stranger to capture that damn Stannis. And Robert, yes, especially him, he should have taken me with him. Why should he leave me here to suffer? Hungry. I can obviously go to the battlefield to earn glory, why do you have to face Stannis's hard stone face? Sooner or later, the Mad King will burn you to death. Yes, you still have the nerve to say it. I'm a traitor. Obviously, in the face of the cruel reality, this middle-aged knight who was quite arrogant before became a little crazy at this time, or he, who knew his destiny well, was too stimulated. Then I saw him kneeling down and crying. Damn it, old Wilder, why did you have so many sons? So many, it won't be my turn even if my eldest brother dies. Why are you so cruel? Why do you want to be the Master of Storm's End? I should have become a hedge knight in the first place. Yes, there is still a hedge to sleep on, yes, a glorious hedge knight. He murmured, crying and laughing, and began to sing a ballad about 6 girls taking a bath together. The dungeon of Storm's End was built inside the cliff under the castle, very close to the cave pier at the bottom. The sound of waves and flowing water could be heard faintly, but it did not bring any elegance, but an unbearable smell of the sea and wetness. Although the lyrics of this song were sweet and beautiful, the tone was full of low loneliness, accompanied by the salty air, and echoed sadly inside and outside the dungeon corridor. Renly took the opportunity to use the old man's walking stick to pull out the false teeth. Chapter 6. I don't understand why you took his false teeth. The old maester asked this question on the way back, but until the end, Renly did not answer this question directly, but just smiled and hummed. Relying on his status as a child, the other party obviously couldn't do anything to him, so he had to leave helplessly in the end. Outside the heavy brown door, the footsteps of the maester gradually faded away. The room was very quiet, and the smell of burning candles kept lingering around the nose. The candle light was reflected on the slightly messy rush mat on the ground, occasionally swaying with the firelight. Sitting at the head of the bed, Renly stared at the lower alveolar dentures wrapped in a white silk handkerchief without blinking, a total of 3, probably made up of real teeth knocked out of the mouth of a dead person. The roots of these 3 teeth at the wooden support were black, and the color gradually turned yellow upwards. A special smell emanated from it as the boy played with it, not a bad smell, but a special fragrance. The ink and parchment were mixed with a trace of burnt. That's right, the fragrance was not emitted by Coach Wilder himself, but his dentures. He had an urge to hold the dentures tightly, as if he could find out the true function of this thing by doing so. However, although he had tried hard to find it, when the time came, Renly hesitated again. What will happen after holding it tightly? Why is it a denture? Or, why is it a tooth? All kinds of thoughts kept growing, making him hesitate, but when he glanced at the round mirror on the shelf table not far away, all negative thoughts suddenly disappeared. In the mirror was the face of a boy who was less than 5 years old, with black hair and blue eyes, and a tangled face, looking worried. A piece of information also quietly emerged: racial level, LV1. Boy, information. Renly silently made up his mind. So he pulled away the handkerchief and held the dirty-looking simple denture tightly in his right hand. Then, he seemed to have touched the door to another world, and his clear thoughts quickly became hazy, as if he was falling asleep. Everything around him became hazy, the red light of the candle was dragged like a meteor in the sky, the hard walls of the house seemed to become a thick and distant dim sky, the feather bed felt as soft as water, as cool as water, water. The black-haired boy collapsed on the bed without any struggle, and a look of surprise flashed across his sleeping face. Time passed quietly, and the newly replaced white wax candle melted from the initial brand new to 1/3. As the flame swayed, the wax liquid dripped like tears, flowing down the column, and finally gathered in the brass plate below and gradually solidified. The originally quiet atmosphere outside the tower gradually changed. The closed windows blocked all the wind and rain outside, but could not stop the rumbling thunder. The shaking caused by the strong wind also made the originally quiet little bedroom noisy. The window glass trembled and wailed, and raindrops came in from the cracks on the edge, and drops of water penetrated in softly and tenaciously. Renly was not affected at first, and he still slumped on the bed like at the beginning, with surprise remaining in his calm face. However, at a certain moment, after the pale flash of lightning outside the window, the black-haired boy who was originally sleeping quietly sat up quickly, and then stumbled and fell to the head of the bed involuntarily, kneeling on the rush mat on the ground and retching painfully. His stomach was empty, but it seemed to be full of liquid. With saliva dripping, Renly stared at the floor and gasped, and his whole body couldn't help trembling. It was not until he noticed the surrounding environment that the trembling slowly subsided, his heartbeat went from intense to slow, and the panic on his face gradually calmed down. This is also fake, yes, all of them, all of them. He murmured, knelt up, and threw the denture in his hand, which still exuded a fragrance, aside with lingering fear, but he didn't expect that along with the ping-pong sound of bones hitting the ground, a sticky green color caught his eye. It was a bunch of seaweed, quietly sticking to the denture like a strand of hair. Looking closely, there were still seawater flowing and dripping on its dark green surface, and spots of white particles like sea salt attached. Staring blankly at this inconspicuous seaweed, he was speechless, but he could no longer say what he had just said. The small bedroom fell into silence, only the occasional thunder roared outside the window, and the strong wind brought heavy rain to the glass window. The heavy rain turned into fine hair and kept penetrating. The stone ground near the window had gathered to form a pool of water, soaking the rushes originally laid on it and making them soft and fragile. I don't know how long it took, but there was a burst of hurried footsteps outside the door, and then there was a knock on the door. "Young master, look! A smuggler has brought us food. Let's go and see." Onion Knight. Renly turned his head subconsciously, but all he saw was the shaking door. There are onions, but they are just smugglers, not knights. Let's go and see, young master. We can still see them now. They are waiting for the butler to arrange a room for them in the hall. Renly did not give the servants a chance to come in. Hearing this, he quickly suppressed his chaotic thoughts in his heart, then stood up and ran out. After asking a few simple questions, he hurriedly rushed to the bottom of the tower with the servants. The first floor of the tower is a vast hall. It seems that everyone in the castle has gathered here and it is very noisy. With the greetings, Renly saw the kitchen helper Tansy, the stable boy Amun, the family guard Ben, and the kennel master Holder. They were gathered together to discuss and make noise, and everyone's expression was roughly the same: surprise, disappointment, surprise and disappointment. At first, Renly didn't care much about all this, because his attention was all on the three people not far from the crowd. One square face, one round face, and one pointed face. They all wore inconspicuous black cloth robes and brown linen trousers, covered with grey wool cloaks, and the opened hoods were wrinkled against their backs and dripping. Although they were currently gathered alone in the corner, they seemed to be pointed at by everyone in the hall, so that two of them were very uncomfortable, but the brown-haired, brown-eyed, ordinary-looking thin man was quite calm. "Your name is Davos?" Renly approached and asked, looking at the middle-aged man who was not quite the same as he remembered with curiosity. "Yes." The smuggler being questioned glanced at the short servant who followed him with his weather-beaten brown eyes, and the boy's clothes made of golden velvet fabric, and bowed slightly humorously. "Lord Renly, Davos is at your service." He had a unique vision and was obviously aware of the situation in the castle. But Renly did not say anything about it, but glanced at the crowd gathered not far away and asked. "Only onions and pickled fish?" "I'm sorry." The other party replied. "This rainstorm was too sudden, and we had no time to react. In fact, if it weren't for the good water skills, you might never see us." He looked very disappointed without disguising it. The smugglers' boat capsized, and most of the food they were carrying was lost. This not only disappointed Renly's original expectations, but also belittled the smugglers' risky action of crossing the blockade to come to the rescue. They didn't save much food. Although he didn't see it, he could understand it just by listening to the discussion not far away. Renly even heard the stable boy say that the food brought by the smugglers was not enough for their own share, and there were 3 more mouths in the castle. "I mean, before the boat capsized, there were only onions and pickled fish?" he asked again. Renly actually wanted to ask why his boat capsized, because normally this boat shouldn't capsize. The Onion Knight should bring a boatload of onions and then become the savior of Storm's End, otherwise why would he be called the Onion Knight? But who can answer this question? Things obviously didn't develop as he remembered, and what does this mean behind it, and what are the consequences of lack of food? He instinctively rejected thinking about this. "Only onions and pickled fish." Davos answered the boy's question. Renly sighed with mixed feelings, stepped back a few steps, said goodbye and was about to turn around and leave. However, he had just taken 2 steps when he suddenly remembered something, so he turned around and looked at the middle-aged man who began to talk in a low voice with his companion. "Have you been to the Iron Islands, Davos?" I didn't expect him to come back and ask questions suddenly, but the smuggler seemed to have been waiting for an answer, and replied without any pause, "I have been there several times, the earliest was 10 years ago, and the most recent was at the beginning of this year." "Do you know about the Ironman's drowning ceremony?" Davos was very curious why the child of the great noble family asked such a question, but he still answered, "It depends on what kind of knowledge you have." "Death, how can we reduce the possibility of death when drowning?" "You can work on the rescue skills afterwards. Although the Ironman's drowned priests claim that they are performing the drowned god's kiss of life, in fact, it is just." "What about the drowned?" Renly interrupted the other party. His blue eyes seemed to have turned into 2 dark pools in the dim environment, and the light emanating from them was unpredictable. "I mean, if you were a drowned person, how could you make yourself more likely to survive?" This. Davos didn't know how to start for a moment. He felt that the question asked by the black-haired boy was very strange. Chapter 7. Davos, the smuggler who ventured across the blockade, brought some onions and pickled fish, but because of the capsizing problem, the quantity was small and did not solve the food crisis at Storm's End. So much so that in the following days, lunch was still simple and even crude. However, Renly's attention has been focused on the dentures recently. Whenever he has time, he will hide in the room to observe it, and then he will be entangled. As long as he looks at the dentures, he can feel a special attraction, as if there is a voice calling him faintly, "Clench, clench the dentures." However, the consequences of clenching make Renly full of hesitation. Experiments have shown that after clenching, he will inexplicably run to an ocean archipelago on the other side of the Westeros continent, become an islander there, and then drown. Just like in his previous dream, he became a knight, but was crushed to death by his own horse. He doesn't care about knights or sea people, the problem is that the feeling of death is really terrifying. But if the tips provided by the smuggler are effective, life is about breaking through yourself. At lunch on the 6th day, he suddenly sighed as he used a silver dagger to pick at 2 dry salted fish on the plate. Having a mountain of treasure but not taking it is like marrying a beautiful wife with great difficulty, but you can't get hard. Can't get hard. The fat man next to him didn't understand this sentence, and blinked blankly when he heard it. What can't get hard? Fists? Why can't get hard? Is it because you don't have enough food? Then I can't get hard either. You know Renly, I haven't had enough food recently. As he spoke, he stole a glance at the 2 humiliated salted fish on the plate in front of Renly, and then blinked at the black-haired friend in front of him. You seem to hate it. Or not fists. Renly interrupted him with a squint. It's probably a mental illness. After saying that, he stabbed the dead pickled fish in the forehead with the silver dagger in his right hand, and then slid off the bench and walked towards the door under the surprised gaze of Fatty. But after a few steps, the black-haired boy turned back and took the plate of fish away. It's better to have something to eat than nothing, he emphasized with disgust, and Fatty sighed. We're going to play in the Godswood forest later. The thin bamboo pole on the other side was originally sneezing and chewing an onion. Seeing this, he hurriedly shouted at Renly's back, and after shouting, he hurriedly raised his sleeves to wipe the tears from the corners of his eyes. Don't forget. You two go. Renly waved his hand without looking back. I'm not an idle person. The two looked at each other when they heard this. He's speaking in a sarcastic way. Maybe Master Crescent has arranged a new course for him. That's the only possibility. He's really amazing. He can stick to such a boring thing for so long. Maester Crescent obviously didn't arrange any new courses for Renly. After returning to the room, he directly left the plate of salted fish on the shelf for later use, and then took out the dentures hidden in the bedside table and held them in his hands. His movements were done in one go, as if he was afraid that someone would come to grab this thing, but in fact he was just afraid that he would regret it. His worries were correct, because he regretted it not long after, but it was too late. After holding the dentures tightly, Renly's originally clear thinking quickly diverged, and then quickly fell into a special state of half-sleep and half-wakefulness. This state may have lasted for a long time, but it seemed to be just a moment. When the cold wind blew, Renly suddenly felt that several people were reaching out to press his head and arms, and he quickly woke up. Unfortunately, before Renly could even take a look around him after opening his eyes, his head was pressed hard into the clear, light blue sea water below. He was no longer Renly, but a young man with obviously strong limbs. Having been here once before, Renly was prepared for this, so he was not at a loss when facing the abnormality, he was just panicked. He knew that he was in a place called the Iron Islands. The Iron Islands are one of the 9 major territories of Westeros. A group of people living on the islands are called Ironmen, and this tenacious nation has a special religious ritual, the drowning ritual. Simply put, it means pressing you into the sea water and choking you to death. Of course, the Ironmen believe that true believers of the drowned god, the god they believe in, will not be afraid of drowning, because they will be resurrected afterwards. If lucky, the drowned can indeed come back to life through the primitive cardiopulmonary resuscitation techniques of the drowned man, the drowned god's priest. Right now, Renly is being drowned, and he very much hopes that he can have this luck. At the same time, he also prayed that the formula that the smuggler Davos said would help him get through the difficulties smoothly, because he was very curious about this dream world and even wanted to see its true face. However, no matter what his mood was, for now, the difficulty he faced was how to avoid drowning. At the beginning of the ceremony, the sufficient oxygen made Renly's senses very clear. With his eyes wide open, he could vaguely see the beach at the bottom of the sea, which was just a palm away, and the green seaweed that sprang out of the sand and swayed with the sea water, and saw a silver fish running away in panic, as well as 3 lines of words sunken on the surface of the sand, 3 lines of strange words. Even though the current situation was very tense, Renly was involuntarily attracted by these 3 lines of words. Unfortunately, his vision was blurred in the water. He only took a few glances. Before he could think carefully, a pair of rough feet stepped on the left side of his sight, and the thick sand brought up covered everything in front of him. The surroundings were terribly quiet. The ocean blocked most of the worldly sounds outside the water. Only a faint prayer sound lingered around, as if it came from the sky. Supreme God who drowned for us, let your servant Hal be reborn from the sea like you. Give him the blessing of sea salt, the blessing of stone, the blessing of steel. The most important thing is to stay calm. Renly said to himself secretly. He kept holding his breath, and the oxygen in his lungs became thinner as the ceremony progressed. Soon, his body instinctively began to urge him to struggle to get up, but the pressure from the back of his head and shoulders on both sides was particularly strong. As time went by, the pain gradually grew, and everything became more and more unbearable. The most important thing is to stay calm. When he couldn't hold his breath any longer, he thought about the key points mentioned by the smuggler again. How can I stay calm when I'm going to die? He remembered that he replied to Davos like this. The stranger who represents death is terrifying, but if we don't want to be completely captured by him, we'd better face him directly. You have to know that this behavior is to survive at the risk of death. The other party replied. Survive at the risk of death, survive at the risk of death. The severe pain caused by holding his breath made Renly's mind hazy and tense. He tried to suppress himself, suppress. Until a certain moment, he could no longer suppress his instinctive desire to breathe, so he suddenly opened his mouth. The wet and salty sea water rushed in. The most important thing is to stay calm. He sobbed to himself. But when his mind was trapped in the pain of drowning and couldn't extricate himself, when the cold liquid invaded his lungs uncontrollably, and when the sea water made his entire internal organs cramp wildly, he vaguely flashed an opposite thought. This is fucking bullshit. Darkness immediately took over his body and mind, and then after an unknown amount of time, a cool breath of life suddenly came slowly from the outside world, and at the same time, there seemed to be a roar. The dead do not die. There seemed to be a sharp-edged pebble under his waist, which made him particularly uncomfortable. He wanted to reach out and pull it away, but he felt that his limbs were stiff and unable to move. The dead do not die. Another roar came, accompanied by a strong knock on his back, and the shock seemed to gradually thaw his whole body. The dead do not die. When the third roar came, he subconsciously thought that he should respond to the other party, so he murmured and opened his mouth. We'll rise again. The other party roared a very famous sentence in the customs of the Iron People, so he could continue. I just don't know if he said this sentence, but everything around him quickly became clear. The cool sea breeze kept blowing, the cold tide licked against the soles of his feet, and the obvious swelling in his abdomen made him shudder suddenly, and then he turned over, bent over on the beach and coughed violently. The sea water was spat out in large quantities due to coughing, and at the same time, his mind became clearer. There were figures quietly shrouding him, and he could feel 3 pairs of eyes staring at him motionlessly, as if expecting something. I will rise again. He responded with a painful cough, then staggered to his feet, and stood on the beach with weak legs. Trembling, facing the 3 encouraging eyes, he squeezed out the last words of this ceremony from between his teeth. It's getting stronger. Chapter 8. The sun high in the sky is very fierce, but the wind from the seaside brings a relaxing and cool breath. Renly, who had successfully survived, stood trembling in the shallows. The 3 drowned men who performed the ceremony hugged him with joy and kissed his cheek. Then someone handed him rough linen clothes. Then he saw that the 3 drowned men started to push another frightened black-haired boy into the water. O Supreme God who was drowned for our sake, let your servants. An old man wearing a shabby black leather coat, bare feet and coarse cloth shorts came over and motioned for Renly to go with him, so the high-pitched and fanatical words gradually faded away as Renly turned and left. This left him free to observe his surroundings. This is a curved beach on the edge of an island. Under the sun, densely packed leather-armored soldiers are active on this beach. Some are walking back and forth, some are fishing in the shallows with harpoons, and some are in groups. The group sat together and chatted. The sea breeze was refreshing and pleasant. Among the crowd, a short soldier with brown hair and black eyes raised his wooden cup and shouted at Renly as he passed by. You passed the ceremony and you proved your piety. Hal of White OU Village, we welcome you. The 3 people sitting with him raised their glasses and followed suit, and more people around him echoed loudly. Renly turned his head and glanced at them tremblingly, but the old man who led the way didn't stop, so he didn't say anything and hurriedly followed them. Next, he met some enthusiastic soldiers, some of whom could call him by name, and most of whom just shouted blessings. As he continued to move forward, Renly did not say a word, but silently observed the strange environment here. It can be seen that the iron-born soldiers stationed in front of the beach are generally very enthusiastic. And none of them look fake, and neither does the island beneath their feet. The soft sandy beach was very comfortable to step on. The cool and pleasant sea breeze blew a strand of brown hair on his forehead, and a puddle of bird droppings fell from the sky above his head with a crackling sound. He turned his head and looked at the green and white thing spread out on his shoulder. The smell was hard to describe. So Renly confirmed once again that this was a real place, not some illusion or dream. If I ran to Storm's End now, what would I see? A comatose boy? Or? Thinking of the dream before, he was thoughtful. But it is clear that this is a difficult thing to accomplish, because the Iron Islands are located deep in the sea on the westernmost side of the continent of Westeros, while Storm's End is on the easternmost coastline of the continent. Moreover, his current identity is that of a brown-haired iron-born boy, not the black-haired Third Master Baratheon, and he cannot enter the castle of a noble gentleman at all. More importantly, he didn't seem to be just hanging out here. Frowning and thinking about the 3 lines of words he had seen when he was drowned, Renly suddenly understood. After he was reincarnated, he most likely awakened some special possession system. Various knowledge he usually learned could be digitized. After his level was raised to a certain level, characteristics could be derived from the knowledge he learned. Encountering a special medium triggers the true purpose of this system to possess others and complete tasks. Is there really such a nonsense? Touching the rough face that was different from that of a child, Renly frowned. The old man was silent all the way, and took him to a tent surrounded by fences at the back of the camp to receive a piece of equipment. A padded white underwear, a pair of old black leather armor that reaches waist length, a round half helmet with an ugly nose guard, a pair of slightly wormed brown hard cowhide boots, a short brown wooden bow and a pair of long a heavy quiver wrapped in a belt. He was finally led to a small group under a coconut tree on the left side of the beach camp. As a result, before anyone could introduce him, a young soldier with blonde hair who was leaning against the tree suddenly stood up. Hal! That's great, I thought you wouldn't make it. Apparently this person is an acquaintance of the current Renly. Yet without inheriting any memories, Renly knew nothing about it. You have proven your piety. Another veteran with messy black hair nodded to him seriously, but then raised the leather wine bag in his hand. So your life belongs to the sea from now on, that's what the drowned people say. This action made the old man who had been silent leading the way stare. Lord Lucas doesn't allow us to drink during the day, Pays. I didn't drink. The veteran named Pays looked at him blankly, then pointed at his open mouth, revealing a set of sticky yellow teeth. If you don't believe it, why don't you hear it? The old man who led the way just glared at the other party, then turned and walked away, leaving Renly standing alone in front of the small team. Except for the veteran named Pays and the blonde boy, there are 2 other people here. A middle-aged man with black hair and an ordinary face is squatting under the shadow of a coconut tree and cooking a pot of thick fish soup with an iron helmet. He holds a spoon and shakes it very concentrating. Another younger, thin man was looking at Renly and the bow and arrow in his hand with a look full of scrutiny. Can you use it, boy? Certainly. Before Renly could speak, the blonde boy who first greeted him rushed to say, in White Gull Village, Hal and I trained together. As he spoke, he pulled Renly to his side, then pointed to a few people around him and said, let me introduce to you, the person you are talking to is Karen, he is very good with arrows. This is the cook Ryan, from the Red Crab Village next door to us, this old drunkard you just heard, he is. This is a team of soldiers put together at once. Renly, who listened and observed silently, soon learned what had happened. Although it may seem like everyone knows the person next to them, in reality this familiarity is only superficial. I'm glad you survived, but Rod the Sea Pig didn't survive. If you die too, then I have to kill the Oak Island guys myself. They will definitely not be happy to accept the iron money I paid, especially when there is no one. When people helped me, it's better now. After introducing his companions, the blonde boy with freckles on his nose did not shut up, but continued to talk nonsense. His name was Jaspi, and even though he didn't ask, Renly knew it from what others said. At the same time, he also learned more information. For example, My current name is Hal, and I come from the same village called White Ou village as this Jaspi. For example, the island under their feet is called Laoik Island, and the king they serve is called Rhodes. He relies on the drowned god's belief to become king, and has gained the collective support of the drowned priests. And I, this team, and other small teams will set sail tomorrow morning by boat to another island called Oak Island to fight for the king who was born in the drowned man. Renly couldn't help but look up at the clear sky. Although heraldry mainly studies the general history and outstanding figures of the Lord's family, it is inevitable that he will also come into contact with some other knowledge during the teaching period. So he understood that Old White Island and Oak Island were actually two islands in the Iron Islands, so he could understand the Ironman's drowning rituals and general procedures, so he could quickly determine what he was facing after clenching his dentures. Condition. What caught his attention was that this group of Ironborn soldiers from Old Wake Island were currently fighting another group of Ironborn soldiers from Oak Island. The Ironborn rarely fought wars with their own people, and there were almost no wars after the establishment of the Targaryen dynasty. Even if he didn't consider other things, Renly felt something was wrong just hearing this. Because he once heard the old bachelor say that the current Iron King of the Iron Islands, Callum Greyjoy, is cautious and sensible, and his rule is very stable. It is impossible for civil strife to break out, and it is impossible for anyone in the territory to call him something. King. When thinking, Renly seemed absent-minded. Even whether the young Jasper or other companions spoke to him, he would just sit there and nod or respond with ah, never speaking. Because being drowned was somewhat of a life or death crisis, and being stimulated to a certain extent was considered normal, no one was surprised by his silence. And not long after, a group of people's conversation made him finally confirm his situation. Let me tell you, it would be better for the Black-Hearted Hall family to be burned to death by the Dragon King. He never thought about our life and death and only built his stone castle in the east. Now you see, stone armor can't stop the Dragon King. A mouthful of spit. The speaker was Pace, an old drunkard. He was grinning widely as he spoke, and his mouth with a missing front tooth was particularly eye-catching. My uncle was there at the time. I heard that the black-hearted old king was so scared that he peed his pants before he was burned to death. Chef Ryan's fish soup was ready, and he was serving everyone a bowl with a wooden spoon. Hearing this, he glanced at the old drunkard suspiciously. Are you sure? The whole castle was on fire at that time, and the whole family of the evil-hearted people were burned to death by the dragon. If your uncle was really inside, how could he still be alive? I don't know about that. The old drunkard boasted without changing his expression, but I guess our family has the dragon blood of Dragonstone. Have you heard of that sentence? Real dragons are not afraid of fire. Renly didn't listen carefully because he didn't need to anymore. In ancient times, there were 7 kingdoms in Westeros. The Kingdom of the North, the Kingdom of the Vale, the Kingdom of the Isles, the Kingdom of Casterly Rock, the Kingdom of the Reach, the Kingdom of Storms, and finally the Kingdom of Dorne. Renly's Baratheon family inherited its territory from the ancient Storm Kingdom and was entrusted by Aegon Targaryen, the founder of the Targaryen dynasty. Aegon was known as the Conqueror because he and his 2 sisters, who were also wives, rode their dragons to conquer 6 of the 7 kingdoms: Northland, Vale, Islet, Casterly Rock, Reach, Storm. Only Dorne was conquered by Aegon's descendants through marriage. During the reign of the Conqueror, Dorne did not surrender and fought to the death against the Targaryen dragons. But the resistance was not limited to Dorne. When the war first broke out, Harrenhal, the king of the River Islet Kingdom, relied on his huge castle, the largest in Westeros, to try to resist the Conqueror's dragon flames. As a result, the whole family was killed. He was burned to death, and the Hall family was extinct. As a result, Nyoda's Heiau Kingdom was transformed into 2 territories: Iron Islands, Riverlands. That was nearly 300 years ago, and Renly had learned this history by the way when he was learning the coat of arms of the Tully family, Duke of the Riverlands, not long ago. And now, glancing at the few Ironborn soldiers still chatting next to him, and then at the huge Ironborn camp behind him that spread across the entire coastline, Renly's heartbeat couldn't help but quicken. It was difficult to make an easy judgment based on a single case, but this similar experience was enough for him to draw a conclusion directly. He was sure that he had come to the era more than 200 years ago, when the Targaryen dynasty had not yet been established. This was secondary. The most important thing was that he understood something. What he had was not some nonsensical possession game, but the power to travel through history. Chapter 9. Hor family is a blasphemous family. On the morning of the second day after the flooding, a tall long-haired drowned gathered nearly 100 people, including Renly's team, and then preached loudly. Because they are blasphemous, the great drowned god drove the dragon of Valyria from the east and burned the black-hearted King Heron to death, and burned all the people of the Hor family to death. In other words, we are free. Freedom! Freedom! Some pious Ironborn followed and shouted loudly, but they all quieted down when the long-haired drowned man raised his hand to signal. Although we have gotten rid of the cruel rule of the Hor family, the great drowned god believes that his people cannot continue to be misled by other blasphemous false kings, so the drowned god specially sent his son, our sacred King Rhodes, to lead us on the right path. As he said, he waved his arm and spoke in a high-pitched tone. Look, Ironborn, this is the supreme gift bestowed upon us by the drowned god. No one is more suitable to lead the Iron Islands than the son of the drowned god, and no one is more qualified to sit on the sea stone throne than him. Long live the son of the drowned god! Long live King Rhodes! Some Ironborn roared, with veins popping out of their necks, and a large number of people followed in loud agreement. But their shouting was interrupted again as soon as it started, and the long-haired drowned man was heard in anger. But not all Ironborn know the greatness of the son of the drowned god, and not everyone follows the drowned god devoutly. His preaching continued, but after Renly curled his lips, he was too lazy to listen to such words that could obviously guess the ending. Although he realized that he had traveled into the history of the Westeros continent, it did not help him much. However, after more than a year of intermittent aristocratic education, he was good at identifying many Westeros emblems and the brief family honors and outstanding figures behind them, but it was impossible for him to know the true history of this world like the back of his hand. So he was not sure about the specific situation of his group. He could only make the best of it, or go with the flow and observe clearly. At this time, he was mixed in this group of people, wearing a black old cowhide armor, with a quiver and a short bow on his shoulder, his back straight, and he looked ready to go. In fact, Renly was about to leave the speech and go to a place called Oak Island. Oak Island was the place where the godless enemies mentioned by the long-haired drowned people were, and their goal of this trip was naturally to defeat that group of people. Renly's goal was also Oak Island, but it was not just because of following the crowd, but also because of the 3 lines of words he saw in the drowning yesterday. Smoothly arrived at Oak Island. Kill 7 Ironmen. Prevent King Rhodes from jumping into the sea. Obviously, his ability is not just to travel through history. But Renly was more vigilant because of this. Since he was in his mother's womb, he could vaguely see the kind of information emerging from him, but he was never sure what that information was. How did it appear? What is its use? What is its relationship with oneself? Will it do any harm? There are many questions to consider, because this may be related to one's future destiny, and because normal people will never have such a thing. However, before that strange dream, before he clenched his dentures, the information that emerged did not let him find any clues, except for the numbers that changed quietly after learning heraldry more and more deeply. Now that this thing has changed, Renly naturally attaches great importance to it, but he is also more cautious. On the one hand, he covets the transcendent power that may be brought by the word Golden Finger, and on the other hand, he is afraid that there may be a trap in it. But behind these cautions, a certain instinct makes him always feel that his suspicious disease is very ridiculous, as if there is a voice in his heart that always says to himself, "Do you need to worry about yourself?" Instinct is instinct, and Renly has never forgotten the doubts he should have about his Golden Finger, because he can't understand what it is. But he doesn't resist it either. It's not sure it's good, but who can say it's bad? So he thought that besides observing, it would be okay to try to accomplish these 3 things. But the problem came again. If he really mixed with the people around him to complete those tasks, he would inevitably enter the battlefield, and then he might be shot to death by arrows. Renly didn't mind being killed, because the experience not long ago proved that after dying here, he would only return to this history, return to Storm's End, and continue to be the 3rd young master of the Baratheon family. It was just that the pain that came with death was really unbearable for him. It's better to live than to die. I can live one day at a time. It's better to complete a task and then see what happens. Give me a reward? Who will give it? Going to Oak Island seems to be quite simple. What if I give birth to a son here? 300 years later, there will be a bunch of great-grandchildren. The brown-haired young man was imagining. After standing in the scorching sun for about an hour, the drowned man priest with long grey-black hair finally finished his pre-sailing speech with great interest, and then waved his hand to signal the more than 100 Ironman soldiers to board a 3-masted warship that had been prepared for a long time. There were so many Ironborn on the ship that there was naturally no room for them in the cabin below the deck. After getting a straw mat, Renly and a few familiar faces from his team made a bunk at the edge of the deck. The cool sea breeze was blowing, and more than 100 soldiers were on the deck, slowly waiting for the end of the voyage. There was endless chatter and laughter, and it seemed quite leisurely for a while. "Hal, when we get to the battlefield, you will follow me." The blonde boy Jaspy, who was leaning on the board next to him, looked at him seriously and said, "My axe is better than yours, so I'm in front and you use your bow to cover me." Renly wanted to say that he didn't know how to use a bow at all, but he couldn't say this at all, so facing the immature face in front of him, he could only nod his head and think about how to get through the upcoming difficulties. The blonde Jaspy didn't notice anything unusual about his companion, and he continued to chatter. "We have never been on the battlefield, so we cannot rush to the front unless ordered by the Lord. I hope someone will accept the iron money I paid, so that when I go back I will be a real iron type, but my father said that as long as I go back, everything will be fine." "Hal, did your father say this to you?" "I don't remember," Renly said honestly. "Are you homesick?" The other party asked strangely. "You used to love talking a lot. Aren't you the same?" Renly didn't answer directly. He has no memory of his previous life, so the best response is to throw the problem back. "I don't, I am a strong person, and strong people never miss home." The blonde boy said this, reaching out and handing Renly a grey-white pebble with a warm yellow color. "Well, this is what I was at home before I left. I found it at the door and gave it to you. I hope it will make you happy." After looking at the stone, Renly reached out to take it and thanked him. The other party said seriously, "The drowned god will protect us, he will definitely do it. The great King Rhodes will also pray for us. Hal, when the time comes remember to follow me, we will go back as a true iron type." The boy's voice was full of hope, and Renly hoped that he would get his wish. However, things are fickle. The sea in summer is like a fickle old woman going through menopause. When the ship sets sail in the morning, the sky is still blue, but it is already gloomy just after noon. Heavy rain was coming, strong winds were coming, and the 3-masted warship traveling against the wind began to move backwards, not to mention moving forward. The soldiers who were lying or leaning on the deck hurriedly got up to avoid being stepped on and collided. The sailors began to rush around and hurriedly removed the raised sail. Unfortunately, a young red-haired sailor accidentally stepped into the air from a high place, screamed miserably, and fell into the wildly turbulent sea, disappearing in the blink of an eye. We don't need to fear the wrath of the storm god, because the great drowned god has already opened his magnificent palace of water to us. Don't forget, the son of the drowned god personally blew the horn for us to move forward. We have God." On the deck, the long-haired man wore a grey, green, and blue coarse cloth robe that rustled in the wind. He held a driftwood stick high above his head. His resolute cheeks like an old farmer turned red as he roared, and he looked very excited. It's just that a strand of his grey hair blown by the wind accidentally got into his throat, and he had to choke and stop midway through his encouraging words, and then he bent over and coughed violently in the strong wind. "Got up. Hal, be careful." The words that floated against the wind seemed very weak. Renly, who was hugging the tight rope tightly beside the ship, turned around to look, and found a rolling barrel on the deck bouncing rapidly. "Coming. Tough luck." After cursing secretly, he lay down on the ground as the ship's hull rocked, and the oak barrel swung past his scalp. He immediately hugged the root of the mast in front of him and refused to let go. The wind was fierce and the rain was pouring. The long and narrow hull of the battleship was like black pepper floating in the iron kitchen pot, rolling and shaking as the liquid boiled. Several times, the side of the ship was even close to being parallel to the sea. It was not until the last moment that it managed to right itself, which was considered a blessing in misfortune. Just temporary luck doesn't mean anything. As long as this terrifying storm doesn't stop, it's hard to say that this warship named the Invincible Midwife can survive the storm smoothly. I'm just on my way. Shouldn't it be the easiest thing? In the storm, Renly's face was covered with rain. After he raised his hand to wipe his face with difficulty, he saw Jaspy, who came from the same village as him, screaming and rolling over as the deck tilted, so he hurriedly stretched out his remaining strength. "Use your legs to block it." His feet could barely hook the middle of the tail of the blonde boy's black leather armor, which made the other boy thank him loudly, but made Renly feel as if his ankles were chopped in half by the hard-boiled leather armor. Unfortunately, his dedication was of no use. In the dark and violent environment, when a more violent storm hit, the invincible midwife shook violently again, as if there was a huge sea monster below dragging it in the storm. A fragile ship, the earth shook and the mountains shook, and many iron-born soldiers on the deck screamed and were thrown into the sea. The blonde boy whose life he had just saved was also in this category. Renly watched helplessly as the desperate and helpless young face of the boy disappeared from his sight. This made his heart feel as if a big stone had been pressed down on him. Out of breath. Your father is still waiting for you at home. He couldn't help but have this thought cross his mind. It's a pity that Renly has no time to care about anything else. Under the thunder and lightning, the heavy mast, which was already slippery due to the heavy rain, finally broke free from his arms after a violent shake. The brown-haired young man fell into the sea. Chapter 10. The storm is raging in the sea, and the world under the sea is also bumping and swaying, as if some god in charge of the ocean is holding his own fish tank in his hands, swinging around for fun, and the creatures in the bathtub can only stagger around involuntarily. Dark, cold, and boundless. The deep sea swallowed up the three-masted warship in the lightning storm, swallowed up a large number of iron-born soldiers as if they were dust, and swallowed up the iron-born's hope of conquering the enemy camp. It wasn't until the next day that the natural disaster gradually subsided, and everything was calm. Renly slowly opened his eyes as the light of dawn filled the sky from the eastern edge of the peaceful sea. At first he stared blankly at the deep but cloudless sky, but then he raised his strong arms in front of his eyes as if he remembered something, and then he felt a little weird. I'm not dead. In the middle of a fierce storm, a person who couldn't swim fell into the sea and could not see the horizon. How could he still survive? While he was puzzled by this problem, a voice came from the side. Want to die? Just turn over. Renly looked out, and a familiar face came into view. He had messy black hair, a round chin, rosacea, and several wrinkles on his forehead. He looked old and ugly. He was wearing a rough linen shirt and wet trousers. At this time, his slightly hunched back was leaning on the bow of the boat, and a leather wine bag was swinging vigorously in his hand. The empty echo seemed to make him very disappointed. Old drunkard Pays, the one on his team. Renly recognized him. At the same time, he also found himself lying on the edge of the plank of an unmasted boat, with the deep sea less than half a meter away from his cheek. You saved me. He stood up as he spoke, but frowned unconsciously. I felt as if my whole body was dehydrated and full of weakness. My stomach also growled as I stood up, and I was very hungry. It's the chef. He's smarter than us. At least he knew how to hold on to the boat on the deck before he was thrown out. The drunkard Pays said while pointing to the brown-haired middle-aged man sitting at the stern of the boat with his head lowered and concentrating on rubbing something. Yan raised his head and smiled at Renly. Are there just a few of us? Glancing at the boat, Renly couldn't help but ask, where are the others? Have you seen Jaspi? The one with blonde hair, the one from the same village as me. The magnificent water palace of the drowned god will open its doors to our suffering compatriots, and your friend will become an excellent sailor in his palace. The last person in the boat smiled weakly at him. The man who spoke was a strong man with long grey and black hair that covered half of his face and the front of his grey, green, and blue cloth robe. He was the leading drowned priest. The great drowned god has not given up on us. You see, the drowned god sent his devout people Lane to rescue us from the evil methods of the storm god. He said in a suppressed voice, and finally couldn't bear it anymore. He coughed violently and seemed to be in great pain. Yes, this is what the drowned god means. The old drunkard on the side muttered, why doesn't he just send us back to the island? We can't use mortal knowledge to figure out the gods. Long-haired Yenren explained with difficulty while coughing. But he clearly has other plans for us. From a closer look, this man no longer had the aura of aloofness and magic that he had when we saw him twice before. Instead, he looked like an ordinary old farmer in his 40s. Unfortunately, Renly was basically not interested in what he said. After silently mourning for the blonde boy for a moment, he changed his attention. The blue sea water rippled under the boat, and the hull of the mastless boat rose and fell. In the dim environment, a total of 4 people were distributed on the 4 sides of the boat, which looked quite spacious. The sea outside the boat is endless, and everything in the southeast, northwest, and northwest is covered by the endless grey ocean. A thin mist lingers on the sea level, casting a shadow over Renly's heart. However, although he was worried about the current situation, he could not be called desperate. After scanning the surroundings, he looked at Chef Ryan, who was busy working. Ryan's nickname was given by the blonde boy from the same village as him. Renly soon discovered that this nickname was actually incorrect, because Ryan was not just a cook. At this time, the supplies on the ship were very simple, including a bundle of thick ropes, 2 broken linen cloaks and the bronze buckles attached to the cloaks, a bow, half a barrel of arrows, a short axe, 2 long axes, and some odds and ends. Bits and pieces of small items. These seem useless, but Ryan relied on these things to make a simple fishing rod. At the same time, he carefully took out a piece of black bread wrapped in linen from his arms. The bread was wilted, moldy, and even soaked in water. However, Ryan pulled out a soft piece of bread from the piece of bread. White maggots. Have you been prepared? Renly approached and asked. We people on Gudeng Island are used to hiding a few bugs on our bodies. The chef said proudly, in this way, as long as you catch a fish with it, you will have enough fish meat to use as bait. The Lone Light is a small island in the Iron Islands, but Renly knows this island because it is located at the westernmost point of the known world. Further to the west is an endless sea that has never been successfully explored. As long as there is enough bait, the people of Gudeng Island will never die of hunger at sea. The cook said as he placed the insect bait, then sat at the stern of the boat and started fishing. When he realized that Renly seemed to be interested in this, he started to explain. I'm not familiar with this sea, but as long as I don't go beyond the Sunset Sea, I can know what kind of fish live where. Of course, the fish in the sea are not honest. You have to know some of their habits and He began to talk about some common fishes in the sea and fishing methods. Seeing him talking incessantly, Renly couldn't help but ask, won't we scare away the fish when we talk like this? It depends on what kind of fish it is. Ryan, the cook who is more like a fisherman, said, some fish will be scared away, and some will come closer. You have to know that the sea water is very clear, and timid fish will not come close to the boat after discovering it, let alone listen to it. To ring. As he spoke, he raised the fishing rod in his hand vigorously, and saw a sharp-tailed fish with a large head and silver scales biting the hook at the end of the fishing line and swinging. It didn't look like it was hooked, but it was it. He refused to let go. The fisherman then raised his arm to hold the fish in his hand, and motioned to Renly, look, these teeth make it very courageous. Renly glanced curiously at the large-headed silver-scaled fish with fangs. Although modern man is well informed, he seems to have never seen this fish with his own eyes. Say boy, do the people in Bayou village only know how to make a living by digging stones? The boat was not big, and the old drunkard on the side could clearly see all this, so he couldn't help but sneered, or are you just going to see the fisherman girl? That's not the case. Renly glanced at him, but didn't pay much attention to this guy. Instead, he suggested to the fisherman who continued fishing, shall I help you? Drowned people are weak and have high status, while drunkards are thick-skinned. We don't know how long the ship will float. It won't take long for the cook to just keep busy. Quickly understanding the current situation, Renly decided that it would be better not to take advantage of the situation. Can. The fisherman had no reason to disagree, but you have to make your own tools. Renly nodded, and the fisherman gave verbal instructions while maintaining his fishing posture. If he wants to fish, he must first have a fishing rod, which is easy to do. The cook still has some ingredients left. It felt very simple when I watched others making the fishing rod, but it was completely different when Renly did it himself. Plus, the old drunkard was always on the sidelines giving random advice, waiting for him to finally tie the fish line tightly. By the time we were on the long pole, nearly an hour had passed. But when he completed this step, he got an extra bonus. You have learned a new skill, fishing gear making LV1. Along with the information that was quietly born, the images of when he just made the fishing rod emerged in his mind one after another, and were deeply imprinted in his memory. With just a little thought, Renly could remember any inconspicuous detail. He wasn't too excited about this because he didn't think he would need this skill under normal circumstances. Renly was curious about the mechanism by which this information appeared. He thought he couldn't see information prompts in this historical copy because no attributes appeared when he looked at himself, but now it seems that is not the case. So he lowered his head and stared at his current body again, but there was still no words about race or class floating out. It's still in effect, but only the real body can have those properties. Renly guessed so. As he sat on the bow of the boat and started fishing using a piece of fish caught by the fisherman as bait, another piece of information drifted out of his mind. You have learned a new skill, fishing LV1. This message was born when a silver-scaled short-tailed fish was pulled up. At this time, the sun was shrouded above the head. Under the sufficient sunlight, the fish jumped and splashed in a large splash until it was hit by an old drunkard with an axe. It just started to become motionless. Then the old drunkard started to gnaw on it regardless of the scales. This kind of fish tastes best when it's alive, he said vaguely while eating, but only dead fish won't bite. After looking at this shameless guy for a few times, Renly rolled his eyes, then turned his head and continued fishing. Unfortunately, he gained little later. Because there are no oars and no direction, the small boat can float aimlessly on the surface of the vast and deep ocean, moving forward with the waves from time to time. The old drunkard and the long-haired drowned man stayed together, while the two fishermen sat on the bow and the stern of the boat until the food gradually became sufficient. If you are thirsty, drink sea water. It still has a bit of salt. If you drink less, we will not die. The fisherman claimed, and then he bit hard on the belly of the fish he was holding with his yellow teeth. The fish was still convulsing slightly. The blood from the wound kept flowing out. Drunkards and drowned men were also feasting on this kind of sea fish. It seemed that eating raw fish was normal for them. Renly stared down at the food in his hands and blinked. After scraping off the scales and peeling off the skin, the pink and translucent body of the fish was exposed to view. Under the sun, the eyes of the dead fish on the big head were round, reminding him that not long ago, the fish was still alive and kicking in his hands. Even though he was starving at Storm's End, he could still eat a bite of normal food, but the current situation had lowered this poor bottom line. Luckily, there's no need to worry about parasites. Sighing, he took a bite. The tender and cold raw fish meat had a hint of the salty smell of sea water. It didn't seem so terrible to eat. He felt that this might be self-comfort. The day after they successfully survived the drowning ceremony, they set sail and encountered a storm at sea that afternoon. But in just one day, Renly gradually adapted to life on the sea. Surrounded by the vast sea, only the boat under his feet could move a little, making him feel like he was in a small ocean prison. The few people on the boat were in pretty good condition. When chatting, they would feel lucky to have survived. They would also whisper curses on the storm and the storm god, who was the enemy of the drowned god. However, they were not concerned about the death of their former companions in the sea. Sad. Apparently they were no strangers to things like shipwrecks, storms, and death. He is also very good at finding food in the sea. The drowned priest named Lucas would wave his arms toward the sea and pray loudly at sunrise and sunset. He prayed to the drowned god to allow them to successfully reach the Oak Island on the other side, and then continue to work for the great. The sons of the drowned god charge into battle. Renly didn't know what this person was thinking. With the four of them, even if they got there, they seemed to be just giving heads to the enemy. At this time, he no longer had any hope of completing those three things. Natural disasters were no better than man-made disasters, and Ahai would not tell them any principles or rules. He felt that if there was a little wind and waves around, the ship might be overturned, and then their bodies would sink into the sea. At the same time, there were no clues left for him to observe in the vast blue surroundings. But he hasn't decided yet whether he deserves to die. Mainly it was too painful. On the fourth day after the flooding, the drifting continued. Renly's fishing skill level quietly improved by 1 level, while the old drunkard who drank too much seawater felt a little upset. You're lucky if you're not dehydrated. Chef Ryan comforted his companion, and then he himself developed a high fever. Renly was wary of these two's mistakes and tried to drink as little seawater as possible. Although it was difficult, he thought it would be fine as long as it didn't last long. On the 5th day, the drunkard and the cook began to drink each other's urine to relieve their thirst. Renly was stunned. As a result, a large barrel of tightly sealed wine floated from the sea that night, solving the water problem of the boat. What followed was there was also a large plate of soaked sour hard cheese. The two people who drank urine seemed to regret this, but there was not much emotion visible on their rough faces. At the same time, this timely supply also slightly alleviated the cook's high fever. By the 6th day, although the cook still looked very weak, this experienced old fisherman from Gudeng Island no longer spoke like he did when he had a fever. However, in the face of this seemingly endless the sea, he was still in a very low mood. I may not live long, he claimed, and then looked at the drowned priest who was huddled on the railing of the ship. Will the great drowned god want an old and useless fisherman like me? Luca Mr. S.I. His voice was filled with tension and anticipation. Hearing this, the other party nodded to him and said solemnly, "The flowing water palace of the drowned god will open its doors to all iron types who worship the god, as long as he is in the sea when he dies." So Chef Ryan smiled contentedly. However, the situation did not develop to that point, because at dusk on the seventh day, the situation changed. The setting sun immerses the sea in gorgeous colors, and the boat keeps swaying with the waves. The old fisherman was standing on the bow of the boat and raising his hands to look out. When he noticed something unusual, his old eyes widened for a moment and his voice became louder involuntarily. "There's a boat. Come and see." Hearing what he said, everyone rushed to the bow of the ship to watch. However, when he saw the sails raised by the ship clearly, the long-haired drowned man suddenly slumped back on the board of the ship with a depressed look on his face. The Kraken flag. The drowned god, save me, that's the Greyjoy ship. Chapter 11. In the vast sea, the sails that swelled with the sea breeze looked like three menacing and ferocious sea monsters. The drifting boat tried its best to lie dormant quietly to avoid its sight, but all this was in vain. When the long-haired drowned man confirmed the identity of the other party, the three-masted warship was already surging towards the direction of the small boat. Even though he knew it was impossible to escape, the boat still started to turn around and escape. At this time, not long after Blackheart Heron was burned to death, the Iron Islands were plunged into civil war. Basically every island had someone claiming the title of king. In other words, every island was basically an enemy to other islands. The sea monster is not king, but he is not our friend. The long-haired drowned man claimed this. Facing the increasingly approaching huge warship, a trace of determination flashed across his face. Then he ignored the others and jumped into the sea with a pop. Unfortunately, this move didn't work. When the other people on the boat were detained and boarded, several enemy sailors wearing thin coarse shorts and bare chests jumped deep into the sea. It didn't take long to find the drowned man who had fled in advance. He looked tall. Wait, but the weakness from the recent storm had not completely dissipated. "A bunch of traitors, you can never get any word from me. The great drowned god will punish you sooner or later," he declared when he was captured. Renly watched all this with difficulty, a look of dismay on his face. There was a storm, a shipwreck, and he was captured again. Nothing good has happened since he came in. Is it time to be beheaded next? Or be pushed into the sea and drowned again? At this time, he was kneeling on the deck. An old sailor with one eye and a bald head and another little brown-haired sailor were holding his arms tightly behind him. The drunkard and the cook next to him were also treated in the same way. "Masters, everything has nothing to do with us. We are just an honest fisherman." The old drunkard begged for mercy, but after being slapped by the fat sailor with a pointed chin behind him, he really became honest. "This road is too long, and I am worried that I will not find any fun." A sailor licked his lips as he spoke, but at this moment, the sailors watching behind him made a commotion. Then there were waves of greetings. "Leader! Leader Viken! We caught a drowned man!" Renly looked up at the sound, and saw a tall middle-aged man with a big nose, strong features and deep eyes walking over from behind many sailors. "Viken Greyjoy!" The drowned priest gritted his teeth upon seeing this. The visitor's lips were pursed and he was not fully armed, but he was also wearing leather armor trousers and hard leather boots. Renly's attention was basically focused on the embossed coat of arms on the front of the brown leather armor. Like the ship's sail, the sigil was also a large squid-like golden sea monster on a black background. However, unlike the sail, he was close enough to Renly. Renly was quite familiar with the surname Greyjoy. It stemmed from the memory of a miserable eunuch in his previous life, and a lunatic who could teleport. Of course, it was mainly due to some education he received after his reincarnation. Regardless of his past life, based on his current understanding, the Greyjoy family in the Iron Islands is the same as the Baratheon family in the Stormlands, belonging to the ranks of kings, dukes, and great nobles. Of course, that was back in Renly's time, but he didn't know much about it now. The only thing he understands is that the ancient Greyjoy family is not easy to deal with, regardless of history or contemporary. His family's motto in the clan language can prove this force is better than hard work. The words of the person in front of me. Renly, who was staring closely at the opponent's squirming crest, narrowed his eyes and seemed to be listening quietly for a moment. In fact, the conversation between the other party and the drowned man was indeed related to the fate of their group. "Are you going to support Sunkenwood Castle?" The words without a trace of vibrato or extra voice sounded calm and majestic. Matched by this man's deep blue eyes, as soon as he spoke, a powerful aura arose spontaneously. The drowned man, who had jumped into the sea before to avoid the sea monster, was now trying to hold up his chest and spoke in a high-pitched tone. "We are going to fight for the great drowned god." Before he could finish speaking, the two sailors holding him behind his back yelled and pressed him hard, but this made drowned man's voice even more angry. "The gods will punish you disloyal people." "That's right, we'll wait and see. The drowned man does not represent the great drowned god, especially you fools who support the so-called son of God," the visitor said expressionlessly, but still gave the order to the sailors. "Let him go." So Yanran stood up staggeringly. "This is just one small step in your quest for redemption," he claimed. These words made the leader known as Viken laugh. "I will not be stupid enough to take you to the island for disposal. This will be seen by many idiots as a provocation to the drowned god," he said. "I don't have the patience to listen to your nonsense. So, if you don't surrender now, this sea is your final destination." The drowned man laughed loudly after hearing this. "We come from the sea, and we will eventually return to the sea. Come on. I am ready to step into the water palace of the great drowned god. Then I'll satisfy you." Viken Greyjoy waved his hand after hearing this, then turned around and left for him. This was obviously just a small episode. The three prisoners were thus dragged up and prepared to be thrown into the sea. But at this moment, a voice suddenly sounded. "According to custom, prisoners can be ransomed." King Viken of the Greyjoy family turned around and glanced at the person who was speaking, as if he had discovered this person for the first time, but the other party's words immediately made him unconsciously interested. "The drowned man is called Lucas, and he is highly valued by the king. If you keep him, you can get something more valuable than a dead body. The customs of the Greenland do not apply here." Looking at the brown-haired and blue-eyed boy not far away, Greyjoy said, "Besides, the drowned man is not a lord, and keeping him will only bring trouble." "Then torture him." The boy said, "You look like you are going to Oak Island?" "Coincidentally, we were originally going to Oak Island, but we encountered a storm, and you are not curious about our original purpose." "Whatever your purpose is," Greyjoy pointed out, "they have sunk into the sea with the storm. If that's the case, why did the drowned man run away just now?" The brown-haired boy, Renly reminded the other party said. He knew that he would only drown if he jumped into the sea without a boat, but he jumped anyway. He also knew that if he was tough, you would not keep him, and that was the fact. "Look, you are now preparing to throw him into the sea, isn't this what he wanted? You know the inside story." "I'm just a soldier." The boy's tone seemed dissatisfied. "Except for knowing that we are going to Oak Island to fight for the king, we don't know anything else, and we don't even know who the enemy is. Do you think this is normal? If you don't even tell us who the enemy is there any value in keeping it secret?" This made the drowned man next to him change his face slightly, and then he cursed, "Traitor, chameleon, etc., but Renly just glanced at him and ignored him. "A living drowned man may not be useful, but a dead one is definitely worthless," he insisted. Upon hearing this, Viken Greyjoy unconsciously touched the handle of a silver axe on his waist. After a moment of hesitation, he ordered the sailors to temporarily detain the drowned man who was cursing, and then looked at the brown-haired boy again with interest. "I may keep the drowned man, but there is no reason to keep you insiders. We just betrayed Old White Island," Renly said frankly. "If we betray you again, then there will be no way to survive." As he said this, he glanced at the old drunkard and the cook next to him. The former nodded hurriedly, and the latter hesitated, but under the close gaze of several sailors next to him, he finally nodded his head. "But what value do you have?" the other party asked lightly. "Cook Ryan is a great soup cook." Renly's chef was kneeling and trembling, "and he's from Lonely Light Island, not Old White Island, where people are great at fishing. All the sailors on this ship can say that." A bald sailor next to him laughed. "What's the use of a fisherman? We don't need a cook. Fishermen are useless, but you can always use them to die in the war." Renly said, "No matter who you fight, put him in front, the price is just some insignificant food. If we keep you, we will have to send someone to monitor you. Chameleons are not trustworthy." The laughing sailor restrained his smile and shook his head. "You can't have only us captives. If you don't have them now, you will have them in the future." Renly stopped paying attention to this person's expression and looked at the only one who can make the decision here. The black-haired one, as long as you give him a pot of wine before the battle, he will be braver than anyone else. That's right. The old drunkard on the side nodded hurriedly. He didn't have the backbone of the drowned man. Renly discovered along the way that this man actually didn't have much piety for the drowned god. He came to join the army just to make some more money. What about you? Do you also want to die? King Viken didn't look at the other two people. He kept staring at the clever boy with brown hair and blue eyes in front of him, and his eyes became more and more interested. All this talk, isn't it just for this last sentence? Renly took a deep breath and straightened his chest. I can read and write. As soon as he said this, he felt that the eyes of the people around the deck were completely different. Chapter 12. When the episode related to the captives ended and the warship named the Predator set sail again, Hal, a young man from White Oll village, had transformed into a clerk under the Greyjoy family. Although his common language was sloppy and exaggerated, and although he was not literate enough to read all the books, he was still qualified for the job, and an old clerk who was responsible for considering him was quite satisfied. This may seem unbelievable at first, but in fact, cultured people are a rare thing in the Iron Islands. Here, being able to read and write is considered a cultural person. The land of the Iron Islands is barren and the customs are barbaric. They have lived by plundering since ancient times. Although their axes and iron swords are very sharp, they are very weak in books and arithmetic. The common people here are illiterate, and the lords and nobles are equally miserable. Even in the entire history of the archipelago, there are only a few literate kings of the Iron Islands. This state of cultural desolation lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, even after the Iron Islands surrendered to the Targaryen dynasty. This situation did not change until the time of Coron Greyjoy in the Iron Islands, which was Renly's time, when the Maester class was introduced to the Iron Islands. Of course, being uncultured does not mean that there is no need for culture. Although ordinary Ironborn believe that those who are literate are usually wizards and the like with weird means, Ironborn lords and even kings still need this kind of special technical talents. It's just that the way they need is to plunder. Just as they did when they were short of other supplies. However, in fact, in the continent of Westeros, although there are more literate groups than in the Iron Islands, it is only relatively speaking. Therefore, cultural people are a scarce resource here, scarcer than gold. It is not difficult to imagine why Renly was able to counterattack. But despite this, he did not gain trust, and people continued to stare at him while working. Renly didn't care much about this. His purpose was just to get better treatment during the rest of the journey. He didn't expect anything else. Under the clear sky, the Marauder, with a slightly bloated hull, sailed leisurely on the sea. The oil lamp hanging on the ship's deck above the head kept swaying as the ship moved forward. In a cabin below the deck, an old man in grey robes with grey hair was sitting opposite Renly, staring at him as he wrote a letter. It wasn't until Renly made the final stroke that he looked away with confidence. You have the talent to become a maester, but it's a pity that you were born in the Iron Islands. Renly smiled shyly at him and said nothing more. The ability of the psychic crest is a bit baffling. At first, he used it to see Fat Ismon taking a shit without wiping his butt, and also saw the possible rebellion of the coach of Storm's End. But not long ago, using the psychic crest, he saw a sea monster is sitting on a throne and thinking calmly. It seems to represent the other person's character in a certain situation in the future. That's why he spoke boldly, and he was relieved. But even if you get away with it, there must be an explanation. Therefore, regarding the issue of his literacy, he lied that it was because he was taught by a bachelor who was shipwrecked and drifted to the village when he was a child. No one doubts his word, at least not yet. Have all the sailors' salaries been calculated? The old man asked. He was once a bachelor in Old Town and was assigned to serve in a certain castle in Westeros. Unfortunately, he was plundered to the remote place of Iron Islands halfway. Renly replied, it has been tallied. I will hand it to the treasurer later. Where is the broken book that Chief Viken needs? Is there anything you can't understand? Most of them can understand it, but I don't quite understand this word. As he spoke, he pulled out a pile of parchment from the shelf table in front of him, picked out a certain page and pointed at the top paragraph. Under the dim light, the old man looked closely at it for a long time before explaining, the word is excrement. The whole sentence means that dragon excrement is hot and hot. A Valyrian slave even had dragon excrement on his head. Pouring it down and boiling it alive. He began to explain word for word, and Renly listened quietly. After his own king was burned by a dragon, the entire Iron Islands were talking about dragons, and Viken Greyjoy, the captain of the Reaver, was particularly concerned about all knowledge related to dragons. He used various means to collect fragments of books containing information about dragons, and then asked the old man to read them to him. It's just that this slave labor bachelor's eyesight is dim, and reading is very difficult, and even inefficient until Renly appears. During the 2 days of sailing, every afternoon Renly would hold the book and read it word for word in front of the other person. This made him seem to become a popular person on the ship. It's just that his family knows his own affairs, and he seems to be very familiar with the Sea Monster King, but in fact he is still just a traitor who cannot be trusted. After completing the tasks assigned to him by the old man, Renly stood up holding the pile of broken books and walked out of the cabin. Halfway through, he met the long-haired drowned man who was imprisoned at the mast of the deck. When the other party saw him, he was not angry, but showed pity on his face. "Son, you have lost your way. I'm pretty sure we're headed for Oak Isle." Renly shrugged. In fact, the ship did not go directly to Oak Island, but took a long way, and even anchored on another island along the way, but its final destination was indeed Oak Island. Renly didn't say much about this. After tightening the parchment under his arm, he walked up the wooden ladder not far away to the rudder area of the ship. At the edge of the ship's plank, the tall leader, who was staring at the sea with his hands behind his back, heard the footsteps and looked sideways at him. "Continue the same page as yesterday." "Yes," Renly answered. He didn't think the other party would be very curious about whether dragon dung could burn people to death, but he believed that as a newly surrendered prisoner, it would be best to speak less when unnecessary. So he began to tell the story carefully according to the words on the page. Renly's voice was smooth and unhurried. Usually the leader of the raiders was not dissatisfied with this. He would listen patiently even if he was faced with a question more boring than dragon dung. But today, his expression became more and more impatient, and finally he even raised his hand to stop the young man from turning the book. "Stop it!" Renly stopped talking and looked curious. The other party stared at the sea, was silent for a moment, and then murmured, "Do you know why I have to listen to you reading these books all day long? My lord wants to deal with the dragon." This was a very obvious thing, and Renly didn't need to hide his clumsiness. Viken Greyjoy nodded. As soon as King Harren died, the entire archipelago immediately fell apart. Some stupid people even rushed to become kings on their own. They thought Harren's death was an opportunity for them, but their arrogance blinded the eyes of those people. He said, looking towards the continent on the other side of the sea, and said in a complicated tone, "Westeros is the target of the Dragon King, but he will never give up the Iron Islands. When the dragon comes, these fools will definitely pay the price. Be king in front of the Dragon King." He sneered and looked at Renly. "You are a smart man. Why are you loyal to Rhodes, the drowned god who will be burned to death sooner or later? Faith? Or do you think the so-called son of the drowned god can really call our gods to fight against the dragon? There are indeed many people who claim to be kings in the Iron Islands. It can even be said that every island has a lord who declares himself king. However, Old Wick Island is an exception. The king is not a lord, but a drowned priest, because all drowned islands have people supported him, so much so that the priest king became very influential. It is indeed because of faith, my lord." Renly replied, thinking of a certain mission of his own in his mind, so he added intentionally. "Faith of the Iron Islands. What's the difference?" Greyjoy heard something in his words. "In the archipelago, all iron races believe in the drowned god, and the drowned people are the mouthpiece of the drowned god. In a sense, they represent public opinion. This is why, my lord, you wanted to execute the drowned people at sea before." The other party nodded. Seeing this, Renly said again, "So I think that when the dragon's fire comes, the drowned people will put on a set of armor of public opinion for me to deal with the invaders. So I join them, not those who rely on power and money. Arm your own king. Do you think Aegon would care what we Ironborn say?" Greyjoy's eyes flickered. "Why not?" Renly answered. "He is a conqueror, and he wants to conquer this land. Dragon fire can help him conquer the Iron Islands. Dragon flames will only bring a scorched earth." Renly said, "Who would be stupid enough to turn the territory he rules into a scorched earth? The Iron Islands have relied on plunder for a living and have a reputation for evil since ancient times. Maybe he will be able to avoid future troubles." "A sinister name?" Renly asked. "A dragon?" Viken Greyjoy was startled when he heard this, and then suddenly laughed. "I don't think your drowned king could be the son of a god. He smiled while turning his head to look back at the sea, but sometimes I think that since he can attract fish, maybe he can also attract sea monsters, real sea monsters, as he claimed. If so, then even Aegon's dragon, even the flames can't make the Ironborn surrender. That's right, as long as there is a glimmer of hope. This was the first time Renly had heard of this, but before he could think about it, the other party spoke again. According to the schedule, we can arrive at the north shore of Oak Island tomorrow. I will talk to the drowned man tonight. If everything goes well, I will let you leave tomorrow. Chapter 13. You have gained a new skill, Archery LV5. Under the scorching sun, when my left foot wearing brown leather boots stepped on the soft sand in a deserted place, a piece of information floated out of my mind. At the same time, a lot of strange memories that did not belong to him emerged one after another. In the memories, there were scenes of target practice and shooting of enemy soldiers on the battlefield. There are the most basic bow-holding postures and more advanced windage recognition. Everything was as if a sleepy person suddenly recalled who he was, without pain or abnormality. And when he stepped forward and left the shallow area, the memory that emerged was firmly imprinted in the depths of his mind. Renly therefore touched the short bough of black wood slung over his shoulder. Hal, I thought you were really a chameleon. A sigh came from the side. It was the cook Ryan who was wearing light mail armor. I was ready to escape, but I didn't expect them to let us go so easily. At this time, this middle-aged fisherman with short black hair refused to believe it and stared at the increasingly distant sea monster warship in the depths of the sea, as well as the small boat they used to paddle and lean on the shoal, with a very expression on his face. Trance. The sea monster has returned? He clearly regarded us as enemies before. How did you do it? Greyjoy thought it would be better to be friends with us. Renly shrugged, not wanting to explain. Anyway, the fact is that they are free, and the original enemy even provided them with 3 sets of equipment as a sign of friendship. At this time, he was thinking about another thing. Can king roads really attract fish? Then there's still a lie. The speaker on his right was Pace, an old drunkard. At this time, he was raising his hand to hold the round helmet on his head. The silver mail on his arms and upper body shone brightly in the sun. I have seen it with my own eyes. The king just jumped into the sea, and the fish appeared right after him. The drowned people called this a miracle. If it hadn't been like this, we wouldn't have gone to serve him. He claimed this, looked at the drowned man in front of him who was walking towards a low bush at the end of the beach, and added in a low voice. I think staying on the sea monster's ship is the only way to be safe. Now that we are free, what can we do? We shall fight for the great drowned god. The cook answered the conversation sincerely. He was a relatively devout believer. Renly didn't pay much attention to their conversation. After thinking about the priest king's mysterious method, he temporarily put it behind him and became a little eager to try it. The newly obtained mission rewards seemed to be nothing to be wary of. Being directly instilled with memories, Renly didn't think he could make any defense against his own memories. He was quite curious about the memory installation mechanism. It didn't feel weird at all, and it seemed to be as profound as what he had practiced all year round. But this has not been tested after all, and he is not sure about this. Then I saw the brown-haired boy pull out his bow and arrow. After opening and closing his fingers to adjust to the feel, he shot an arrow at a crooked-necked coconut tree about 20 yards away. The sharp arrow pierced the air quickly, and after a flash in the sun, it was inserted high in the trunk of the coconut tree with a thud, and the tail fins trembled and buzzed. Seeing this, he nodded with satisfaction, and then explained to his 2 surprised companions. Try the feel. The drowned man in the other direction squatted down in front of the bushes for a moment, then stood up and waved to them, so the 3 of them ran over. We are now located on the yellow sand beach on the northwest side of Oak Island. A deep voice came from the drowned man's mouth. His brown eyes were bright, and his figure was tall in a grey, green, and blue robe, but his cheeks were sunken on both sides and he looked much thinner. There is a mining village 3 miles away from here. We will go there later. Now, let's set up camp and rest. We need to eat. He paused for a moment, then looked at the brown-haired boy who straightened his back, and his tone was much gentler. Hal, get familiar with your bow as soon as possible, we will use it soon. The drowned man is not someone who forgives others easily. He was even quite cold towards the cook and the old drunkard who had surrendered before, but his attitude towards Renly was much kinder. Not only did this man regain their freedom, but he also initially gained a powerful potential ally. The underlying reason is that Greyjoy did not explicitly express his support for the Drowned Kingdom on Old Wake Island. He only had a preliminary intention to do so. The specific details will require continuous consultation between the two parties in the future. But even so, this incident was enough to transform Renly from a chameleon into a brave young man who endured humiliation. "What is our goal?" the old drunkard on the side couldn't help but ask. After hearing this, the drowned man thought for a while and said, "The Holy Majesty Rhodes not long ago sent soldiers to capture the Driftwood Castle in the west of Oak Island, but now it is being besieged by those ungodly people who want to rob it. Go back. So we are going to support that Driftwood Castle," the old drunkard said, "just the four of us. We want to save Driftwood Castle, but it won't be the four of us." The drowned man replied calmly, without explaining much. So the troubled group started lighting a fire on this remote beach and started catching fish. While the other two were busy, Renly secretly ran to the drowned man to ask about the specific plan, but unfortunately, even though the drowned man had a good impression of him, he still didn't answer. Obviously, he thought that this matter must not be revealed. Renly just shrugged his shoulders and suppressed his curiosity in his heart anyway. The drowned man's actions did not conflict with his goals. This is the 8th day since Renly came to this historical place. In the short and long 8 days, as a fake Iron Man, he has experienced drowning, storms, shipwrecks, drifting, being captured, and being a traitor. At that time, he was in the disaster and felt that time was passing very slowly, but now he felt like he was in a dream. It seemed that he stepped onto the island in a trance and completed one of the 3 things. After a preliminary understanding of the operation of this task mechanism, Renly has completed the basic requirements for himself. It would be best if he could continue to complete the other 2 things next. He would not be disappointed if he couldn't complete them. This was his first time to officially explore this historical world, and he didn't expect to gain much. Instead, he was full of curiosity about whether he could change history and then change reality, but he was not sure what to do to change history significantly: dragon? Conqueror? Or? On the beach, the cook Ryan began to make a fire with flint, using branches to support his helmet as a pot, and the old drunkard ran to the nearby forest to look for dry firewood. Renly ran to the shallows, stepped on the soft sand barefoot, holding an arrow with a sharp tip but several white scratches upside down, and looked for fish in the cracks of the pebbles. The group finally had a meal of fresh fish soup and salted dried fish here, and then began to follow the drowned man's ass and headed towards the mining village he mentioned. The name Oak Island seems to have something to do with trees, but in fact, most of what we saw along the way were rocky hills and sandy land that were dried and hot by the sun. Occasionally, we could see yellow-green pines and cypresses that were growing sluggishly, and some plants that Renly couldn't name grew dryly in the cracks of rocks everywhere, looking ugly but tenacious. As the journey went on, the mail armor he was wearing became hotter and hotter under the sun, and his shoulders were a little overwhelmed. The sultry heat from being far away from the coastline made everyone's forehead sweat. Continuously going deeper into the island, the group walked on remote roads under the guidance of the drowned man who was familiar with the place, but they did not meet the Icelanders here. Until they arrived in front of a small village built on a raised hillside. The village seemed hazy under the sunlight. The sparsely distributed wooden houses looked like a group of grey tombstones standing under the hills. In front of these tombstones, some Icelanders wearing dirty white shirts could be seen gathering together, digging something with iron pickaxes. "Ryan, go to the east entrance of the village. There is an old camphor tree there. Hide behind the tree. If you see someone running out, don't hold back and shoot him directly. Pies goes to the north entrance and finds a hiding place like Ryan. Hal, you guard the west entrance and be careful not to let anyone go." From a distance, the drowned man began to order them. "When you see me come out, you must follow me closely." What does he want to do? Renly observed the drowned man's face and found that his eyes were firm and serious, so he didn't say anything and walked towards the hill he was assigned to. When he hid himself and looked back at the way he came, he found that the back of the drowned man, wearing a grey, green, and blue coarse cloth robe, had already stepped into the village and was talking to the villagers gathered at the head of the village. Recruiting people. He touched his chin and thought of a possibility. The storm caused a ship of soldiers to be buried in the sea, leaving only 4 of them. No matter what the goal is, it is obviously impossible for them alone. But if the drowned man recruits people here, this is not impossible. Although the old Wake Island where the drowned man is located is in a hostile relationship with Oak Island, the drowned man group has a huge influence in the entire Iron Islands, and can even be called a spiritual leader. But even if he can gather a group of people, what use will it be? Renly is very curious about this. Let a bunch of rabble go to that driftwood castle to rescue? The drowned man said that their goal was to rescue the place called Driftwood Castle, and Renly had learned some geographical conditions here when drinking fish soup before. Not to mention whether it would be possible to gather the peasants on the spot to rescue, the Driftwood Castle seemed to be on the other side of the island, very far away. There was too little information, and the drowned man refused to say anything, so Renly felt a little confused. But considering his second mission to kill the Ironman, he did not take the opportunity to leave, but thought about it while paying attention to the situation at the entrance of the village. After a while, the people at the entrance of the village surrounded the drowned man and walked into the village, and their figures disappeared in the group of houses covered with thatched roofs. Not long after, a black-haired old man appeared at the entrance of the village, paused for a moment, and ran quickly towards Renly's direction. Seeing this, the brown-haired boy clenched the black wooden shortbow in his hand. Chapter 14. The arrow whose tail was made of white gull feathers disappeared from sight instantly as the rough fingers loosened. The sound of the bowstrings tight playing echoed in his ears, followed by a sudden scream. 10 meters away from the grey stone where the archer was hiding, a hurried blond man was hit by an arrow in the chest. He was shaking all over, and his body that subconsciously moved forward was unable to move and fell to the ground. It seemed like a fatal move, but the archer did not relax. Instead, he pulled out an arrow stuck there from the dry ground behind him with his backhand, and skillfully placed it on the bow. The sun was strong and the brown-haired young archer was soaked to the skin. Sweat stains rolled down from the edge of the iron half-helmet he wore on his head to the bridge of his nose. With a slight sting, the bowstring that was pulled up quickly loosened. After a brief sound of breaking through the air, there was a dull sound of metal pouring into the body. The blond man who was slumped facing the ground twitched once again after being hit by an arrow, and then there was no sound at all. The young archer then stared at the seemingly silent village at the end of his sight. He put down the bow in his hand when he didn't notice anyone else approaching, stood up and walked to the dead body, pulling his legs and dragging him hard. The chainmail on his body rubbed with his movements, and the purple scar on the bridge of his nose continued to send out bursts of severe pain. When he finally dragged the body behind the stone, the sweat seemed to have the whole person was completely submerged. He casually released the dead man's ankles and let his feet fall on the stone to twist and deform. He struggled to take off the iron half-helmet on his head. At the same time, he grabbed the wet and soft cloth cap under the iron helmet and threw it on the stone, but nothing happened. Carefully, the tail of his hat lightly scratched the bridge of his nose. Renly gritted his teeth as severe pain struck him. He therefore glanced at the dusty clearing behind him where the dead body lay. The red-haired boy, the black-haired old man, and the guy with short light blonde hair who looked like a blacksmith. The blood from the arrow wounds of each of the 3 corpses continued to flow out, and eventually it gathered under them to form a bedboard composed of dark red liquid. It was the afternoon of the 8th day after Renly entered this place. I remember correctly, today was his first time to kill, but I don't know whether it was the memory of archery skills that gave him the corresponding change in mentality, or whether it was his innate personality, even though he watched the living beings pass through his own hands. It turned into puddles of dead flesh, but he didn't feel sick or have any other abnormality. On the contrary, Renly felt inexplicably ridiculous. I wonder if I will be as ugly as them when I die. The stinging pain on the bridge of his nose made him couldn't help but glance at the black-haired old man who stared blankly at the sky with his eyes wide open. Although he had a mission, when he first faced the old man with silver-white hair, Renly did not kill him. Instead, he shot an arrow in the man's calf, thinking that it would prevent the man from acting normally. Enough. However, the cruelty of the war and the consequences of this soft-heartedness left him with lingering fears. When he put down his bow and arrow and reprimanded him, the opponent directly picked up an axe on his back and threw it at him. Renly was completely caught off guard. If the iron helmet on his head hadn't blocked the attack, he would have been torn apart by the axe. Only the helmet blocked the axe blade, but the nose guard on the helmet was dented by the huge force of the iron axe, which directly caused the bridge of his nose to be bruised and purple at the moment, and he seemed to have lost his appearance. Thankfully this isn't my real body. Muttering, Renly looked up at the sky and realized that it was already dusk. They arrived here at noon, but the drowned man had not left the village yet. This made him unable to help but think about it, but this did not prevent Renly from putting on the helmet and rag hat that he had thrown aside after a short rest. There were originally 16 arrows in his quiver, but now there were 11 arrows left that were not stained with blood. As a result, 3 Oak Island villagers died in his hands. And he's now waiting for the fourth. But when the fourth figure actually appeared in sight, Renly hesitated again. It was a young woman who hurried over with an infant child in her arms. Her long brown hair was messy, and the light blue button-back skirt she was wearing was also covered with grey and white patches. Now she was walking in a hurry with her head lowered. From time to time he raised his head and looked around. It's a pity that she never saw the person she should really pay attention to. A jet-black arrow flashed under the dusk light and struck the sandy ground in front of the woman with a hiss, causing her to scream subconsciously. Then she saw a young boy with a bow appearing from behind the stone. And now this man is fully drawing his short bow and aiming with narrowed eyes. Stop, take one more step forward, and I will, the boy started to warn, but the other party screamed in horror, then hugged the child tightly and turned around and ran away, regardless of what he was saying. This made Renly a little dumbfounded for a moment. You are the stupidest woman I have ever seen. Muttering, Renly kept aiming the bow and arrow at the opponent's back, tightening his fingers again and again, but never letting go, until the woman ran out of range and ran into the village. Seeing this, Renly sighed and put down his bow. Just as he was wondering whether he should run away before the villagers came out and hacked him to death, a group of people suddenly appeared at the entrance of the village at the end of his sight, each holding an iron pick, sickle or even a wooden stick. Led by the motley tall figures, they moved forward menacingly along the road in front of the village. One of the bald old men happened to encounter the woman running back, so he grabbed her and dragged her into the group. They did not go towards Renly, but walked on the road held by the cook Ryan. Remembering the drowned man's words before leaving, Renly quickly put away the few arrows stuck on the ground behind him, and then hurried towards he chased after the group of people. The drowned man has gathered a group of villagers. Where are they going? An old drunkard wearing light mail suddenly popped out halfway, trotting next to Renly. Go and fight for the great drowned god. Renly replied angrily. He thought this was actually nonsense, but this question could only be answered with this kind of nonsense. Hanging far behind the group of people, he saw Chef Ryan quietly appearing in the other direction and following the crowd. It was unclear what the drowned man was doing, so he didn't run forward, and the same was true for the old drunkard. Moving forward in a hurry until the light of the day has completely faded away. Then they saw a unique siege battle. When the silver moon cast its cool light on the pine needle-covered ground, the group of villagers had already arrived at the door of a rock castle standing towering on a hill. The castle has no outer walls, and a raging moat connects to the faintly visible coastline not far away. A group of people who were blocked by the moat gathered around the drowned man. There were soldiers patrolling the city wall scolding them to retreat, but no one moved. The drowned man then blew a whimpering horn sound that sounded strange. Then he saw that the wooden suspension bridge that was originally suspended high suddenly trembled, and then took a photo. The gates of the castle were opened immediately. Is this the legendary magic? Renly was a little stunned when faced with this situation, but the old drunkard next to him reacted quickly. When he saw the group of villagers pouring into the castle, he suddenly yelled in regret, and then ran towards the castle. Go quickly, if it's too late, we won't have a share. Chapter 15. A fight that exceeded Renly's expectations began. At the same time that the castle gate was opened, the bells in the castle rang loudly. The farmers organized by the drowned man rushed in with crude weapons, and then the shouts of killing and panic were heard. The soldiers on the city wall woke up belatedly and hurriedly launched an offensive, but they seemed to be few in number and the effect was not great. Under the moonlight, the chaos inside and outside the castle intensified. The water in the moat was turbulent. When I ran across the wooden suspension bridge, gravel fell into it and disappeared instantly. The old drunkard in front rushed quickly, but it was obviously not because of bravery. Because the group of people had previously opened the way, they were not attacked when they first entered the city gate. Instead, they could faintly see the faces that remained in the killing cave next to the city gate. This made Renly realize something, but now was not a good time to think about such things. Dozens of farmers had already dispersed by the animal houses at the city gate and rushed in all directions. The soldiers on the city wall hurriedly returned to defend, but were surrounded by a larger number of enemies. The battle on the battlefield on the right has ended. 5 villagers are eagerly picking up the weapons and armor from the defeated and rushing towards the depths of the castle, ignoring the 2 injured and dying companions on the side. At the entrance to the city wall near Renly, 3 soldiers wearing mail were surrounded by more than twice their number of farmers. A farmer wearing a light linen shirt stabbed one of the soldiers with a shovel, but was completely blocked by the opponent's armor that shone darkly in the moonlight. The defender counterattacked with his sword and cut off half of the attacker's neck. But at the same time, the hand axe in the hand of another bearded villager suddenly hit his helmeted head. There was a loud noise and the soldier he staggered back, but the axe-wielding villager was very fast. He aimed at the gap in the gorget exposed at his neck and took the opportunity to hit the axe again. The soldier screamed miserably and blood splattered from his neck. The other two defenders were not idle during this period. One of them was fending off the siege of 3 strong men, and the other was pulling the blood-stained sword out of an old man's chest. Then he trembled and looked down. After looking at Arrow's chest, he fell to the ground. In a moment, 2 more arrows struck, hitting the last soldier's shoulder and chest one after another, ending his fight. Seeing this, the farmers gathered around the ground without hesitation and snatched away the weapons and armor worn by the soldiers. Renly did not stay here longer, because the battle at the city gate had basically come to an end. After scanning the road ahead that was spread by thatched houses and towers, he tightened his bow and arrow and ran forward quickly. Renly originally thought that the battle in the castle would be a stalemate, or even at a disadvantage. However, he did not encounter any formal battles along the way, but instead saw only brutal massacres everywhere. He saw a thin old man with grey hair lying dead in a pool of blood, and not far from him was the headless body of a thin boy. I saw 2 villagers in the stable pulling a maroon warhorse with greedy faces. A stable boy who looked to be about 12 or 13 years old was bleeding from his abdomen and huddled in a corner, sobbing uncontrollably. He saw a fat chef wearing an apron at the door of the kitchen, holding a kitchen knife tremblingly and confronting the villagers, but all he received was laughter and ridicule from the enemies opposite. I even saw a naked girl standing in the mud crying loudly, while her young mother not far away was being pressed to the ground by a bald old man and being brutally tortured. Bloodshed and tragedy filled the castle. Renly stepped forward and knocked the opponent to the ground with a punch. The interrupted bald old man stood up angrily from the ground and roared at Renly, "Go grab food elsewhere, boy. She is me." A sharp arrow interrupted his words, and the long arrow held upside down in his hand was like a dagger, piercing into the opponent's mouth where spittle was flying. Under the sound of whooping, the attacker half knelt on the ground, and finally collapsed and died. "What are you doing? He is with us." Chef Ryan jumped out of nowhere and grabbed the boy's arm, his face frightened and angry. "Not anymore." Renly kicked the opponent away and then strode deeper into the castle. Halfway through, he saw another companion, who was hiding furtively in the corner of the alley with his clothes in his hands. He grinned with joy when he saw Renly. "Come on Hal, I found a room full of jewelry. We are going to get rich." Unfortunately, the other party did not stop following his words, and even just glanced here and left in a hurry, which left the old drunkard a little confused. "What kind of stimulation are you getting?" he muttered, looking down at a large handful of jewelry in his arms, and couldn't help but grinned. Halfway through his laughter, he suddenly closed his mouth tightly, looked around carefully, and then quickly slip. Renly saw the drowned man in an open tower hall. He was talking quietly to a middle-aged man in shining mail and dressed as a garrison in a low voice. When he saw the young man, he waved. The man turned and left. "Gord is a devout believer of the drowned god. He and his people helped us open the city gate," the tall drowned man explained to him. "You can see that," Renly said as he glanced at the departing figure. The drowned man was very mysterious along the way, but now he has figured out his specific plan. Their original goal was to rescue the place called Driftwood Castle, but the rescue method was not to go straight in, but to run here to surround Wei and rescue Zhao. The drowned man was well prepared, knowing that this place was empty, and even prepared a traitor. Unfortunately, the storm caused all the soldiers he led to die in the sea. As a last resort, he could only run to recruit villagers as soldiers. But these soldiers... At this time, Renly had calmed down, but the screams and cries coming from outside the hall still made him upset. "Your people are like beasts, harming the natives of this castle. This is what they deserve." The long-haired drowned man, wearing a grey, green, and blue coarse cloth robe, replied, "The belief in the drowned god can make those mining slaves stand on my side, but only tangible benefits can make them hold their weapons tightly and fight for us. The so-called benefits are to act recklessly." The boy couldn't help asking. He was actually a little mentally prepared for this, but when he saw it all with his own eyes, he was still full of disgust. This is one of the indispensable rewards. The drowned man noticed that the other party's tone was wrong, so he frowned. "You must remember that our great drowned god has never been a kind god. The drowned god created the iron race so that we can burn, kill, and plunder. Is it the same for our own people? They are not our own people. Their masters and men are besieging our castle. They are among the ranks of traitors. The drowned man replied indifferently, and then raised his hand to interrupt Renly, who wanted to continue speaking. Let's stop here about this matter. You are still young and have never experienced the cruelty of the way of war, but sooner or later you will get used to it all. Now, there is something you may be able to help me think about. Renly did not speak, but his expression became colder as he looked into the depths of the other party's blue eyes. Our original plan was to garrison this whip castle and lure the Tawny family, who were besieging Driftwood Castle, to come back for help. But the storm god made us lose all our men, and I'm not sure if we can stop Todd Tawny's counterattack with just the people we have now. You need help, Renly said as he thought, and the many scenes he encountered in the castle flashed through his mind one after another, so he knew what he should say. We need real warriors, not these miners who can only swing pickaxes. It's lucky enough to use them to take down this castle, you can't ask for more. The real warriors are on Old Wyke Island. Then send a letter back to Old Wyke Island to ask for help from His Majesty the King. We don't have ravens from the Greenland to deliver messages, so we can't send letters at all. Send the old drunkard, send Ryan, send anyone who can go back to get reinforcements, use a small boat, as long as the wind direction is right, it will be fast. Renly said, the current manpower in the castle should be able to hold out for a while. Besides, it will take time for the enemy to return here. But it's still too slow. The drowned man frowned and thought, do you think we have any other options? He is a senior priest of the drowned god, who is good at calling believers and holding ceremonies, but that's all. You can call on more local believers to come here to help defend the castle, or you can take prisoners to threaten the Tawny family. Renly pointed out. But you can't be sure that the people you summon are really on our side. Maybe they will secretly open the castle gate for our enemies like Gord did. This is enemy territory after all. Without the baptism of war, I really can't tell whether the believers of Oak Island are pious. The drowned man frowned even deeper. But I will never use prisoners to threaten the enemy. The drowned god will not allow us to be so weak. The reason may not be limited to this. Renly shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. You are right, we do need to ask for help, but Ryan and pies are not worth using. After thinking for a while, the other party said something that Renly silently expected. I hope you can go on this trip for me. Chapter 16. The chaos lasted all night. At first the chaos was just Ironborn killing and scrambling for loot. But in the middle of the night, a hunting dog that was originally kept in a cage suddenly burst out and ran wildly throughout the castle, barking like crazy, making the situation here even more crazy. However, the overall situation will not change. So when the sun rose from the far end of the ocean the next day, the castle called Whip Castle had completely changed its owner. The white nettle whip flag on the castle tower that marked the original owner's family was casually torn down and allowed to be trampled on. The armory in the city has also been emptied. The villagers who were once a group of mining slaves are now wearing armor and weapons that can only be used by soldiers and even noble lords, which makes them look like they really are. That's what happened. However, the survivors of the tragedy in the castle can never forget what kind of people they are. During the cleanup on the second day, dozens of dead bodies were carried out from all over the castle and thrown into the moat outside the city wall. They disappeared from people's sight with a popping sound, silently, as if they had never existed. The family members of the Tawny family, the original owners of the castle, were now being held tightly in a high tower, led by the cook Ryan. Of course he should be called Captain Ryan now. Another veteran who followed, the old drunkard Pays, also transformed and became one of the captains of the city wall. He was more easygoing than Ryan, and in a short period of time he had already formed a good relationship with his new partners. One slice. Renly has been waiting for the drowned man to allocate ships and men to him to return to Old Wyke Island to ask for help. During this period, he met the young woman he had helped in the castle, but she just hugged her child tightly and showed hatred towards the heavily armed young soldiers. He also saw the younger mother he had let go while hunting at the entrance to the village. Unfortunately, he saw her from the tip of a gun on the city wall. She was no longer complete, and was miserably reduced to only a head. She was a traitor and wanted to tell the truth, so Gord had her killed. Her cub was lucky and didn't remember anything, otherwise he would have been killed too. The old drunkard explained when he stopped to observe. She is indeed stupid. Renly nodded in agreement, then turned and left. Looking at his back, the old drunkard raised his hand and touched the stubble on his chin, his eyes full of suspicion. After the battle, there were rumors in the castle that Hal had killed one of his own, and also pushed the victim's relatives who came to him to argue with him down the well. So someone went to Pastor Drowned Man to complain, but the pastor secretly suppressed the matter. The waiting time was not long. That afternoon, Pastor Drowned Man arranged for a small speedboat and 6 supporting sailors. The food supplies have been prepared long ago, so there is nothing to hesitate. Renly immediately headed to the coastline not far from the castle. Don't be afraid of the wrath of the storm god, the drowned god will protect you. The drowned man who came to deliver it in person said, you have to come back as soon as possible, we can't hold it here for long. I promise to do it as quickly as possible. Renly nodded solemnly. It's the 9th day since we arrived here. And among those 3 things, he has already completed 2. The goal of reaching Oak Island was completed first. Thanks to a former miner who unexpectedly came out to attack him last night, the mission of killing 7 Ironmen also came to an end. If someone looks at his left hand at this time, they will find that the originally empty middle finger is wearing a rusty bronze ring. The color of the ring is gloomy and black, and there is a faint protruding ghost eye. Gaze of the dead, this is a ring formed by the thoughts of the dying person before death. Using it, you can evoke the deepest fear in the target's heart, 6/7. Originally the ring could be used 7 times, but Renly used it once while experimenting with it when he first obtained it. This was necessary, and he didn't feel bad about it. Instead, he had a new idea because of it. The sea breeze was smooth today, and as the sails swelled, the boat began to sail toward the west of Oak Island. The young man stood on the bow of the boat, watching the coast and the drowned man's tall figure getting smaller and smaller, until finally he couldn't see it clearly at all, and then he looked back. The ship was very small and only had 1 level. Everyone could see it at a glance. The 6 sailors on the boat were talking animatedly, but when faced with the boy's gaze, they timidly lowered their voices. The Iron Islands follow a slave labor system. The captives snatched by the Ironborn from outside constitute the slave labor class of the Iron Islands. Although slave labor is different from slaves who can be bought and sold, they are also inferior and have no freedom. These are the slave working class before us. However, the sea is vast and uniform. As the voyage continues, they gradually become familiar with Renly. King roads really attract fish and sea monsters? A young slave worker with short chestnut hair asked curiously. I heard that's the case. Renly replied absent-mindedly, sitting on the bow of the ship and stroking the bronze ring on his left little finger, I'm going to go and verify it. If I dedicate myself to the great drowned god, can I really be free? An old slave rower asked hopefully. As long as you survive the drowning ceremony, you can be freed from your status as a slave laborer and even become a drowned priest. The brown-haired boy said, your children will also become free people from now on. Renly was not a native Ironborn, but he gradually learned many of their customs while wandering at sea. He even learned that Lucas the Drowned was once a slave laborer. How many salt concubines did you steal at Whip Castle? Another young paddler asked curiously, is there any long-legged Jenny? She is very beautiful. I hope you stole her. Shauna is also very beautiful. Maybe you took her too. The Iron Islands have unique customs. Unlike Westeros, they do not practice monogamy. They can plunder women outside and then forcibly marry them as concubines. This is the so-called rock wife and salt concubine. In the archipelago, each iron type can snatch several or even a dozen salt concubines from outside, but they are only allowed to have 1 wife, and the wife must be a local of the archipelago. No, not one. Renly shrugged, because I'm not sure if, according to the rules, we can take one of our own Ironborn as a salt concubine. This was Renly's excuse, but one that the oarsmen argued about. This does seem to be against the rules. The rules also say that Ironborn cannot hit their own people, but no one cares about it now. Those are not our own people. Lord Lucas said they are a group of betrayers. Del, who has red hair and is full of curiosity about everything, taciturn big and small Rob, yellow-teethed and skinny old Lum, and Wells, who is blind in one eye. The sailors on the boat seemed to be very good people, just like the cooks, drunkards, and drowned men in the past. They also paddled very hard. Under the watchful eye of the bald supervisor Eng, they rarely saw slacking off. When getting along with them, Renly could not help but think of the boy from the same village who was with him when he first set sail, of the pebble he unfortunately lost in the sea, of the boy who talked about the king and the drowned god. Tone at the time. What would he have done if he had reached Oak Island alive? Renly was curious, but the question would never have an answer. There were no big storms on the way back, and the wind direction was basically smooth. It took the group 8 days to get here, but the return trip didn't take that long, or it was much faster. As the sun rises and sets, the boat sometimes raises its sails and sometimes sounds the oars shouting. 2 days later, a hazy coastline was faintly visible, and the journey had finally reached its destination. The beach on Old Wake Island is still densely populated with camps. Some figures in leather armor shuttle back and forth. There are many fishermen with their trousers rolled up to their knees in the shallows. However, the first ones to spot the boat were the scouts wandering on the sea. Vessel. The boat was intercepted by a scout ship. After Renly explained the situation, he said goodbye to the slave workers and was taken to the brig. His Majesty is presiding over the ceremony. The bearded captain of the scout ship explained this with envy. The boys who were flooded today are really lucky. I bet that they will all become famous Iron Men in the near future. There must be a lot of people watching, right? Renly asked. Of course, His Majesty the King rarely does anything himself. Renly groaned and looked at the beach coastline that was slowly receding as the ship moved forward. This place seems to be almost the same as when he left. At a glance, there are endless coarse cloth tents located densely, the rising smoke of the bonfire dissipates in the wind, the vendors accompanying the army shouting and selling, the children running and playing, and a place growing in the distance. Under the towering hills of bones, there was a long line of people waiting to be flooded. Everything looks full of life, harmony, and tranquility. He finally saw his king in the shallows under the hill. It was a shirtless young man with strong features. He was standing in waist-deep water and was performing a drowning ceremony for a blond boy with his own hands. It is a pity that despite his high-pitched prayers and the sacredness of his kisses, the drowned person who was constantly convulsing did not wake up in the end, but turned into a cold dead body. Father needs him, more than we need him. The drowned king stood up and declared without any signs of expression, he will become an excellent sailor in my father's palace of flowing water. A group of people watching the flood heard the words and cheered loudly. The sound was loud. It seemed like I had seen something happy. It is a supreme honor to be delivered by the sacred son of the drowned god to the flowing water palace of the great god. The bearded captain also lamented and sighed. Renly narrowed his eyes when he heard this, stared at the young king who was starting to hold the ceremony again, and secretly confirmed his thoughts. So when the priest king finished drowning the fourth man and finally had time to meet with him, the messenger returning from Oak Island, Renly stepped forward and declared loudly. Your Majesty, I have brought a letter from Lord Lucas, as well as another very important news. News about Aegon Targaryen. Chapter 17. Although the drowned king mixed with his people to show his friendliness, he at least knew not to create panic among them, and Aegon the Conqueror and his dragons were obviously the source of panic. So when Renly's announcement fell, he immediately dismissed the people around who were watching the excitement. The beach, which was originally crowded with people, became much quieter. A large number of believers were blocked by the king's soldiers in the distance. Only the king himself and the 2 guards behind him stood in front of Renly. Observing closely, the drowned king actually looked quite ordinary, with a flat nose, light blue eyes, a square chin, and some freckles on his cheeks. Only his tall body and long dark green hair looked very eye-catching. The long hair flowed down the gaps on both sides of the hood that was recently put on, like a strange seaweed. Of course, Renly was more concerned about the emblem embroidered on the front of the other's grey, green, and blue wool robe, a glowing driftwood stick with an arm raised on a blue background. To others, this emblem seemed to fully demonstrate the holiness of the drowned man, but to Renly, the glowing stick quietly withered and turned into a thin rotten tree root. This made him more certain of his thoughts. So when the king asked him for details, Renly handed over a letter written on parchment. This is a letter from Lord Lucas to His Majesty. This letter was actually written by him, because the drowned man Lucas could not read or write, so he could only dictate it to Renly and ask him to do it for him. A tall blonde guard of the king stepped forward to take the letter, but the drowned king himself did not pay much attention to this. Instead, he could not wait to ask, "You said there is a letter from Aegon Targaryen." A sudden scream interrupted his words, and the scream caught people off guard. The blonde guard who had just taken the letter turned around and ran away with a pale face, and the letter that should have been in his hand was thrown away by him without any care. The king was stunned on the spot, and another guard behind him shouted loudly at the fleeing guy, but at this moment, the crowd watching in the distance suddenly burst into exclamations. Because the brown-haired boy who had bent over to hand over the letter suddenly jumped up and pounced on the king himself. Everything happened so fast that it was hard to keep up, running, shouting, screaming, and jumping up. When the screams appeared one after another, the drowned king with dark green hair had been thrown to the beach by the audience. After a moment of stunned silence, the black-haired guard wearing a light mail and leather jacket roared and swung the long-handled axe in his hand to chop at the figure that pounced on the king, but the other party turned over on the spot and moved his body under the king. The sharp long axe suddenly tilted and chopped on the beach surface beside them with a bang, splashing a lot of sand and dust. This temporary change of attack seemed to make the guard very uncomfortable. His round face flushed red, and his eyes widened as he looked at a dagger across his king's neck, while the owner of the dagger glared at him fiercely at this moment. "Let go of your majesty!" he roared angrily, and with an uproar, the believers who were blocked in the distance also quickly gathered towards this beach. "Back off, or I can't hold my strength!" the brown-haired boy declared loudly, dragging the captive to stand up and retreat with difficulty. "Your name is Hal? You should be our loyal warrior. Who ordered you to do this?" the captured king asked. His face remained calm, but then his ear was pinched hard, so he couldn't help but cry out in pain. "Damn it, he is blaspheming the gods!" The round-faced guard, who was afraid of the consequences, looked furious, but dared not move rashly, and even trembled with anger. The large number of believers who approached were also furious, gritting their teeth and wishing to eat the attacker Renly alive. However, the parties concerned were mostly focused on the king in their hands at this moment. At this time, he had his back to the sea, and in front of him was a dense crowd of figures. There seemed to be drifting ships not far away in the ocean, ready to move, and some soldiers aimed their bows and arrows at him. The situation was precarious. Renly's heart beat fast, and his muscles couldn't help but tense, but the tension accounted for most of it. In any case, it was the first time he faced such a situation. But it was not just him who was doing it for the first time. The drowned king, whose neck was tightly held by him, looked calm, but his body was shaking unconsciously, and his voice was trembling. "Let go, the wrath of the drowned god is coming. If you make a big mistake, you will be thrown into the cold hell of the storm god." Renly ignored his words. At this time, he kept holding the dagger tightly against the prisoner's neck with one hand, and the other hand was across the prisoner's face. After a glance around, he whispered, "Look at my hand." Although he didn't want to obey, the drowned king couldn't help but glance at this hand. This is a hand with stubby fingers, muddy nails, and calloused palms. In other words, this is an ordinary Iron Man's hand. The only thing worth noting is a bronze ring on the middle finger of this hand. No, it's not a ring, but a ring with colorful rust on the surface and a ghost face protruding on the inside. It seemed that after just one glance, the drowned king felt that all his eyes were being sucked into the bronzed face that was so close at hand. All the hustle and bustle around him quickly faded away, leaving only the terrifying, twisted skull-like face in front of him. It got bigger and bigger, until it filled his entire field of vision, until the huge skeletal mouth swallowed him whole. Then, deep down, he saw God. A scream of horror suddenly came out, and the young king who had been held hostage and managed to remain calm suddenly began to struggle in the enemy's arms. His eyes widened and his face turned pale. Renly had to exert force to prevent the other party from breaking away from his embrace. In the end, he had to pierce the other party's cheek with a dagger to make him become more honest. The onlookers didn't know what happened, but they seemed to feel the same way. Some couldn't help sobbing, some shouted in despair, and many more shouted angrily that those who blaspheme should die miserably. However, the presence of these crowds did not bring much comfort to the king. He was shaking all the time and his eyes were filled with fear. "The drowned god, save me! No, 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 I didn't mean to, I never meant to pretend to be your son, it's all them, yes, it's all them." Seeing this, Renly secretly breathed a sigh of relief, and then said in a low tone, "Let me answer your question just now. Yes, it was the drowned god who sent me to find you. Now, tell me. How did you summon the school of fish? How did you deceive these Ironborn?" I just used the powder ground from Naga's ribs." Information that was difficult to obtain under normal coercion was easily asked at this time. The captive in his arms was shaking and crying. "As long as you sprinkle a small amount, the fish in the sea will. But I didn't think about becoming king at first, yes, I didn't, it was all them, yes, they forced me." He accidentally spoke a little too loudly, and the guard closest to him opened his eyes wide unconsciously, looking at his king with disbelief. However, he suddenly discovered that this usually holy and majestic son of the drowned god, at this moment the lower body of the robe was already soaked with urine. So everything is your lie? Son of the drowned god? Holy kingdom? The questioning continued. No, that's right, I'm just an ordinary fisherman's son, not the son of a god. Louder. I didn't hear you. These words made the drowned king suddenly hesitate, but Renly showed off his ring at this time, and the grimace appeared again. The man in his arms suddenly tensed up, and then collapsed in his arms as if he had lost all his strength. In an instant, turned into a pile of soft bones. I confess, I am a liar, a complete liar. His crying and howling voice spread throughout the beach, so much so that the originally noisy and angry crowd suddenly seemed to have been splashed with water. Cold water, all sounds suddenly stopped. I've been good at diving since I was a child, and many people thought I was qualified, so I became a drowning man. The secret of the ribs was told to me by the old drowned man who taught me, but he didn't know how to use it. He was very, very stupid, so I killed him so that the secret would be mine alone. Heron was burned to death. I thought this was an opportunity, and then I actually didn't want to be the king, but those drowned people insisted on me. I also like boys. What he wanted to hear, what he didn't want to hear, what he expected, what he didn't expect. The young priest who was crowned king by 40 drowned men was leaning against Renly, crying all over himself. Everything he did was told. People strolled in, and the increasingly angry faces kept approaching, old wrinkled cheeks, young and immature teenagers, dark-skinned fishermen, women holding children. The anger rising to the sky seemed to make the sea wind sweeping around them much stronger, but the target of their anger was no longer the previous attacker, but their king, the son of the drowned god who they once admired with all their hearts. The crowd kept getting closer, and when he saw that the situation became precarious, Renly pushed the prisoner away and quietly retreated. No one paid attention to his presence anymore, and everyone's eyes were fixed on their majesty the king who was lying on the ground. This weird atmosphere made the person involved quickly escape from the state of panic. He leaned on the sand and swallowed, then supported his body with his arms and kicked his feet on the ground, trying to stay away from the angry crowd in front of him. The former guard who had been watching his every move suddenly stepped forward, grabbed the collar of his robe and roared angrily, "Liar! Liar! He is the real blasphemer! The drowned god punishes him! Fake, all fake! My poor child! Shame!" Countless angry shouts quickly erupted like a firewood pile. A violent scene was born behind him and intensified. Renly left quietly and ran towards his target. The Naga rib may sound strange, but Renly knows about it, and even now it is in his sight. The place where they are now is called the Sacred Coast, and the coast is named after a place called Naga Hill not far away. On the approaching hill, 44 towering ribs like huge white tree trunks broke out of the ground, like curved and hard white ancient trees. The Ironman believed that these bones were the world's first sea dragon Naga's ribs. The king of the ancient Ironborn, the legendary Grey King, killed the sea dragon Naga himself and made a palace out of its bones. Now, there is only a pile of huge bones left in the ancient palace, but the Ironborn regard this place as a holy place, and Old Wick Island has become the most sacred island in the archipelago. But this sacred place has become extremely noisy at the moment. There are many angry people on Renly's way, but in the face of this scammer, they unconsciously give way, so Renly can run up the hill smoothly. This is a barren and rocky hill, located high up, where you can overlook the entire sacred coast and the sea in front of the coast. The sun shines down, and the shadows of 44 huge ribs cover his head, making him feel as if he is in an ancient and barren palace of bones. The roars, accompanied by screams of fear and wails, were clearly audible. Looking down at the large number of ant colonies that seemed to be attracted to a corner of the beach by honey, Renly suddenly felt that he should speed up. So he touched the hand axe on his waist, clenched his hands, and chopped hard at the nearest bone. He looked like he was chopping a tree, but unfortunately his chopping was not very effective. After a loud collision, only an inconspicuous crack appeared on the surface of the rough rib he was aiming at. Renly was a little dumbfounded, but he did not give up. His mind was racing. He suddenly bit the handle of the hand axe in his mouth, and then used all 4 limbs to climb up along the root of a rib. Under the vast and bright sky, the beach was crowded with people, but the Hill of Bones, which was usually regarded as a holy place by all the Iron people, was ignored at this moment. A tiny figure crawled on a skeleton and kept moving forward, finally straddling the top area of the curved ribs, waving the axe in his hand and chopping vigorously. Thousands of believers roared angrily, the king's wailing was completely drowned out, and the dull chopping sound was mixed in these chaotic noises, which was almost inaudible. And when the drowned king, whose body was covered with terrible bruises, was stripped of his clothes, screamed and was held high above his head by his former people in anger, and walked towards the sea, the chopping sound suddenly disappeared. Since obtaining the bronze ring, Renly couldn't help but think about a question. The mission goal is to stop King Rhodes from jumping into the sea. So if the target is no longer the king, or there is no chance to jump into the sea forever, is this mission considered completed? Chapter 18. In a trance, the cracked bones in front of him faded away and finally turned into darkness. The noises below the hill also quietly subsided during this process, like a movie that ended, and the curtain closed after the song ended. The darkness was silent and deep. In a state of half awake and half asleep, Renly didn't know how long it had been. In a daze, he only felt two pieces of information emerging in his mind. You have obtained a new skill, Dagger Mastery LV5. You have completed all events, and you have obtained the item, the sacred statue of King Rhodes. When Renly woke up again, he found himself slumped against the side of a feather bed in a quiet little room. The stone floor was hard, and his hands could only feel cold and rough. The surrounding atmosphere was peaceful and serene. The pale yellow silk bed curtains floated with the cool sea breeze blowing in from the open window, and the complicated brocade hanging on the fireplace kept rubbing against the wall, rustling with the wind. The sun was shining outside the window, and the shouts and cries of children could be heard faintly. The familiar voice made Renly blink, and then he took a deep breath. As a result, a foul smell instantly rushed into his nostrils. It was the smell of a plate of salted fish on the bedside table behind him, which made Renly's sense of ease and comfort just emerge disappear immediately. Salted fish, sea breeze, two little idiots. It didn't take long, otherwise Xiaomi would have found me lying on the ground. Muttering, a memory of using a dagger kept churning in his mind, stabbing the enemy, turning and hiding, how to deal with other weapons. Everything was finally deeply imprinted in his mind, just like when he acquired archery before. Renly then looked down at his hands. These were a pair of slender little hands unique to children, but the things in his hands were completely different from when he first entered history. In his right hand, the dentures that were originally held in his palm have now turned into a handful of corrupt grey-white dust. As the boy's fingers moved, they kept spilling on the stone floor. It was no different from normal sand and dust. He lowered his head and sniffed, but there was no smell left. It's gone after passing the level. Renly frowned, shook off the dirt on his hand, and looked at the items in his left hand. A rusty bronze ring that was obviously several sizes larger was currently hanging on the middle finger of his left hand, and at the same time, a pale, thin broken bone with cracked teeth was also tightly held in his hand. Renly breathed a sigh of relief. Although he was drowned when he entered with his dentures before, he accidentally brought out a seaweed, so he guessed that he could take something out of it. Now it seems that this is true. But the one I cut off is obviously not so short, and why can't clothes and the like be brought out? After pondering for a while, he couldn't figure it out, so he decided to ignore this problem for the time being. At this time, in addition to the ring and the broken bones, there was also an old and dull yellow wooden sculpture of a little man lying on the ground next to him, pressed on a light green rush on the stone floor. This seemed to be the final reward. After picking it up, Renly lowered his head and looked at it carefully. The little man was carved from oak, with a brown-yellow color, without any craftsman's breath. The statue itself was angular, the figure stood upright, touching his chin in a thoughtful posture, his face and robes were lifelike, and it was obviously the appearance of the drowned king. When Renly looked at it, no information emerged, but he saw a line of words in the common language of Westeros engraved on the base below the wood carving. "Maybe I am a mermaid." He whispered this sentence, but as soon as the voice fell, the seemingly ordinary statue suddenly creaked and shattered, and then collapsed in an instant, turning into a piece of sawdust like dust that accumulated in Renly's palm. A tingling and cold feeling grew from the palm of his hand, and the brown dust quickly melted into the palm skin like ice and snow melting in the heat, and then there was no trace of its existence. But the tingling and cold feeling did not disappear, but spread quickly throughout the body like cold air. At the same time, a message emerged. "You have received the blessing of the ocean, and you have awakened the characteristic the breath of mermaids. I feel that I have become a little different, but he can't tell how different." After being stunned for a while, Renly looked at the mere silver-plated round mirror on the small table in front of the window, wanting to check his gains again. However, the angle of his sitting on the bedside table was a little wrong, and the lower half of the round mirror could only reflect his forehead, so he stood up and walked over, and by the way, he closed the window inlaid with green glass, and the noise of the children below became inaudible. The round mirror clearly reflected his cheek, and when he looked at it, a pair of beautiful blue eyes also looked at him. Racial level, LV1. Knowledge, Heraldry LV7, Archery LV5, Dagger Mastery LV5. Knowledge, Fishing LV2, Language LV1, Etiquette LV1, Fishing Gear Making LV1. Derived characteristics, Psychic Emblem, Mermaid Breath. Several pieces of information emerged one after another, but unfortunately there was no explanatory text for the newly acquired Mermaid Breath, which made him completely confused for a while. After thinking about it, Renly straightened his messy blue velvet top in the mirror, smoothed the wrinkles on his brown trousers, and then stepped out of the room wearing a pair of flat slippers. At the door, I happened to meet my personal servant Xiaomi, who was catching up. He was very surprised to see him going out. "Young master, what are you going to do?" "I'll go find Maester Crescent," Renly said as he walked away. "Xiaomi, let's go with you." The servant Xiaomi who was left behind shouted, "We have nothing to do anyway." "Okay, I'm just missing a companion to study with." These words made the short servant pause, then he touched his forehead and said hesitantly, "Xiaomi suddenly remembered that the cook in the kitchen is sick, and he wants us to work for him. Xiaomi will not agree with him first." "There you go, farewell, Master Renly." After he said that, he turned around and ran away. Watching the other persons back hurriedly leaving, Renly curled his lips, feeling that the mud could not support the wall. The old maester was still in his small room filled with bottles and parchment books. Facing Renly who opened the door and walked in, his eyes broke away from a red book. "I heard you didn't have lunch." "I ate a kipper. It was in the room. It was dry and salty." Renly, who was empty in his belly, said as he glanced at a bookshelf near the small table and pulled out a book from the dazzling collection of manuscripts. Then he picked up the parchment book with a grey cowhide cover and an iron buckle and climbed onto the stool opposite the old bachelor. Due to his height, he could not sit there formally, so he had to kneel on the chair, straighten his back and lower his head. Opened the book. Most of the pages were schemed by him, and it wasn't until a page at the back that he suddenly stopped turning the pages. After the burning of Harrenhal, Aegon Targaryen and his sisters set their sights on the remaining countries in the Seven Kingdoms that had not yet surrendered. The Iron Islands lost their king and fell into chaos. Harlaw Island, the Womack family Colin, the leader of the group, has the blood of the Hall family, so he claims to be the legal heir of the Black Blood and takes the lead in claiming the throne. On the sacred Old Wick Island, 40 drowned priests gathered under Naga's ribs and placed a driftwood crown on the head of one of them. The king supported by the drowned people was named Rhodes, considered to be the living son of the drowned god. In the first year of the conquest, Aegon Targaryen was crowned Lord of the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros, Warden of the Realms, and King of the Andals and the first men in the Starry September in Old Town. The following year, Aegon rode the dragon Balerion arrived on Great Wick, and with him came a huge fleet. The invasion of foreign enemies ended the fighting and civil strife in the Iron Islands that lasted for more than a year. The drowned king of Old Wick Island turned to his father the drowned god for help, hoping to summon a sea monster to stop the invaders' fleet. The sea monster did not appear in the end. Then the drowned king filled his robes with stones and walked into the sea to discuss with his father. Thousands of people followed him into the sea. The Ironborn were unable to resist the conqueror's dragons and fleets. The Iron Islands finally surrendered. Aegon Targaryen allowed the Ironborn to determine their own rulers. The king's moot was therefore held under the rib of Naga on Old Wick. Lord of the Reavers, Viken Greyjoy became the ruler of the Iron Islands and House Greyjoy continues to rule to this day. In the 37th year of the conquest calendar, Aegon Targaryen died of a stroke on Dragonstone. His son Aenys succeeded to the throne. Rebellions broke out across Westeros. Priest King Rhodes claimed to have finally returned from the drowned god's father. Leading a rebellion against the Greyjoy family's dominance, the rebellion failed and the priest king's head was sacrificed to the Iron Throne. The only sound in the quiet room was the sound of turning books. The old maester, who closed the book in his hand, looked at the name marked on the spine of the grey cowhide book opposite and asked kindly, "Are you suddenly interested in the history of the Iron Islands?" No matter where they are, studious children are generally very popular, especially when surrounded by a group of idiots who are tired of learning. "That's right." Renly nodded absently, filled with disappointment that he could not rewrite history, but then he reacted, raised his head and added, "Not just the history of the Iron Islands, I am interested in all history." Chapter 19. The blue eyes struggled to open wide in the water, and when they looked through the clear water at the bottom of the basin that was close at hand, the originally bright and transparent silver basin bottom became hazy, as if it was covered with a layer of frosted glass. A few sporadic small bubbles adhered to the glass, moving around or rising and disappearing with the large bubbles occasionally spit out by the children. There were all kinds of noises in Storm's End in the morning, including the trampling of servants on the stairs, the sounds of guards patrolling and talking, the butler's scoldings, etc., but all the sounds seemed weak and ethereal when they were transmitted to the water, as if they came from another world. During the diving process, the cold feeling of the liquid in the basin penetrated into the head and even the limbs along the cheeks. Gradually, the washing water seemed to turn into warm hot water. With the initial stimulation, the eyes had already adapted to opening in the water. Even though I kept bending down for a long time, the soreness gradually spread from my back to my whole body. So in the end he had to straighten his back. Under the splash of water, a handsome little face was exposed to the air, and a refreshing feeling came from it. The boy pulled the white wool towel aside and wiped his face while guessing. 10 minutes? 20 minutes? He pondered and looked carefully at the basin in front of him. There was obviously no air supply during the dive, but he felt that the oxygen in his lungs was constantly being replenished as the cool water penetrated, so that the length of time he persisted was simply extraordinary. But he didn't know if it was an illusion, but he felt that the water in this basin seemed to be less than before. Shaking his head, the boy raised his hand and picked up a clay cup that smelled of cloves on the small table next to the basin. He then dipped the branch inside into the salt mixed with spices at the bottom of the cup and began to concentrate on brushing his teeth. There is a toothbrush in this world, and it is probably made of pig hair. However, Renly felt that the pig hair was a bit dirty, so he followed the common people's example and chewed one end of a twig to brush his teeth. Anyway, without toothpaste, no matter how hard I brush, I won't be as clean as I was in my last life. After a while, there was a knock on the door outside. "Young master, it's time to eat. Just come." After a vague response, Renly rinsed his mouth with another cup filled with water on the small table. After spitting out some salt cleaners and a few plant sawdust into the basin, he turned around and walked away. Wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. It was probably a quiet day. Renly especially enjoyed the peace since returning to that history yesterday. "I'm going to take a shower tonight." After going out, he gave instructions to the servant guarding the door, and then walked to the lower floor where the dining room was. All the chaos and strife ended with the shattering of the denture. Renly, who was different from before, looked the same, and the situation around him was basically the same. Siege, hunger, food shortage. Before the siege of Storm's End, Renly mostly ate with his current family. But there weren't actually many people there. Not long after he was born, his parents in this life died in a shipwreck, and his elder brother Robert was adopted by the Duke of Vale. His so-called family members were basically his second brother Stannis and the elder the Maester Cresson, his playmate Fatty Allen, and his great-uncle Hulbert, who had died at the beginning of the siege. Occasionally there will be some vassals, knights and family vassals, but not too many. But now, due to the siege, Stannis basically lives on the edge of the city wall. The old bachelor also doesn't go to the table very much. There are only 3 little guys who can get together. Obviously, children eat very quickly, especially when the food is scarce and monotonous. Usually lunch can be finished in less than 10 minutes, but today is a little different from usual. In the restaurant, Renly was sitting on the left side of the long partition table. The other 2 were opposite him. The black-haired boy with his head lowered was frowning at the food on the plate as before, but the silver dagger he held upside down in his hand was frowning. It started without any hesitation. He saw the tip of the dagger sinking steadily into the head of the salted fish, and then with just a slight movement, the fish head that should have been hard and flexible was easily cut off by him. Then the dagger in the boy's hand cut the whole fish into 4 pieces, each of which looked about the same size. Finally, with the movement of the slender fingers, the silver dagger was turned from upside down to upright with an astonishing dexterity. The owner of the hand used it as a fork, and stabbed the salted fish strips several times like a small stabbing sword. A boneless piece of fish meat is thus separated. Fatty Aaron looked at all this, then looked down at the identical dagger in his hand, and felt that this thing was clumsy and heavy. "Renly, you seem a little different from before." After the black-haired friend inserted the piece of fish meat into his mouth with a dagger, he finally couldn't help but say something. Really? Chewing the salty food in his mouth, Renly said vaguely, I heard that eating too much pickled fish will cause bad breath. It's not bad breath, I mean. Barry, have you noticed that you have bad breath? The black-haired boy looked at the thin bamboo pole next to Fatty. The other person was currently fighting an onion with his head down. He seemed to particularly like eating raw onions. Eating this can remove the odor. Bailey, who was as thin as a bamboo pole, raised his hand to indicate the food in his hand. It's particularly effective. I mean the dagger. Your Pang Dun on the other side spoke persistently, but was interrupted immediately. Then did you find Aaron? These words made Pang Dun couldn't help but look at his companion beside him. Who would pay attention to that? The other party replied blankly, but I think he must have it, you see he is so sloppy. The rest of lunch became a little noisy, but basically nothing happened to Renly. After finishing his portion, he said goodbye politely, but did not attract the attention of the two friends who were quarreling. He stuck out his tongue in response and left the place quietly. The old maester who heard the noise happened to rush over at this moment. After nodding with him at the door, he stormed into the room aggressively. Next, Renly heard a burst of scolding and arguing, but what happened next? Attention! A special smell attracted his attention, but before he could identify where the smell came from, he heard something strange. Patch Face is dead, master. The short servant Xiaomi whispered to him when he returned to the door of the bedroom. He should have died long ago. Xiaomi means that he was already dead when Xiaomi dragged him out of the sea. In a noble family, a servant who talks nonsense may be reprimanded by a stern master, but Renly has always liked people to tell him gossip. This is not to say that he can get any useful information from here. The main reason is that it is boring. In a world where entertainment is scarce, gossip is one of his few remaining interests. But this matter is not just pure gossip. How did you die? Renly asked with a frown. Patch Face is the jester who ran away crying when he saw him that day. He originally came from the free trade city across the narrow sea. It is said that he has a talent for comedy, but it is a pity that Renly has never seen it. After the fool was bought across the sea and was about to arrive at Storm's End on his return voyage, a storm and a reef sank the ship he was on, and the sea swallowed him up. After he was spit out, the fool turned into an idiot. Sick, master, he is sick. I heard he has been sick for a while. Xiaomi replied, but none of us found out that he was sick, and it turned out that he was lying in the room and died of illness. It seemed that he had been dead for several days. He shook his head as he spoke, his words melancholy. When Xiaomi dragged him ashore, his mouth was swollen. After that, his speech was hard to hear and his brain became hard to use. This is all Xiaomi's fault, alas. But we originally thought he is already dead. He feels cold and greasy to the touch, he is just a dead person. Renly did not continue to listen, because he was already walking towards the stairs. The strange smell was still lingering around his nose. It was somewhat similar to the one he smelled before, but it was also very different. It seemed to have a rotten smell. When his back was about to disappear at the top of the stairs, the short valet realized what he was doing and hurriedly ran over and followed the boy. Although the castle is very safe, the situation is tense at present, and the servants must keep an eye on the young Baratheon son who has not grown up to prevent anyone from plotting evil. Renly finally found the source of the smell from a dilapidated courtyard in the castle. It was a burning fire. 5 people stood quietly in front of the fire and watched, and the smell of corruption was wafting from it. The difference from inside the tower is that when you get closer, the smell is not only stronger, but also mixed with the smell of burnt grease. Shipwreck Bay swallowed up the boat they were in, but the sea gave us back the damned fool. As he approached, someone spoke to him. He was one of the 5 people in front of the fire, and the young leader guarded by the other 4 male servants. He had black hair and blue eyes, and a thin but tall figure wearing brown and black leather armor. When he lowered his eyes to look at Renly, it's quite cold. He also turned into a retard. What do I want from a retarded jester? This was more like a murmur than a question. At least you like him, Renly replied. I don't like him, never have. Then why did you keep him? I tried my best to keep him by my side, the young man said hesitantly. I tried hard to find joy in him, yes, I tried. I thought maybe this could fulfill my father's last wish. Renly looked at the other party silently and did not speak again, because the other party was not asking him or anyone else. That shipwreck not only turned the fool into a retard, but also swallowed the Duke and Duchess of Storm's End, Stephen Baratheon, and his parents in this life, into the sea. At that time, Renly was still a pink baby sucking milk from a wet nurse and did not witness the disaster, but the second brother in front of him and Robert, the eldest brother, witnessed the disaster with their own eyes. They were standing on the towering walls of Storm's End, watching the ships sinking in the bay ahead. The dark storm raged in the sky, and Renly had no way of knowing what his two brothers were feeling at that time. He only learned some minor details of the incident afterwards. For example, the disaster should not have happened. It was the captain's operational error at the time. For example, the Duke and Duchess brought him many strange and interesting toys from the Free Cities. For example, Maester Cresson once received a letter from Duke Stephen when he was across the narrow sea. The letter mentioned Rigoletto in a very complimentary tone, claiming that he could make his lonely second son learn to laugh. Obviously Patchface is not a qualified jester. Renly thought to himself. Since he could remember, he had only seen the second brother beside him named Stannis smile once, and that was the smile he showed when he heard that his parents were about to arrive at Storm's End on their return voyage. Then I never saw him again. I don't like him. The atmosphere was silent for a while. When the fire in front of him burned out, revealing a charred corpse, the young man next to him said the last sentence. But I should have sent a maester to treat him when he was sick, instead of letting him die of illness. Stannis' voice did not have any self-blame, but instead revealed a faint sense of fatigue. Obviously, the current situation facing the castle made him a little overwhelmed, but the expression on his angular face was still as stiff as stone. A thought flashed through Renly's mind unconsciously. Should I find a way to put that Naga rib to use? He thought so, and then his face suddenly froze. At this time, the servants had already started to deal with the charred bones, and he could clearly see that the blackened mouth of the corpse was obviously missing some teeth. After counting and looking carefully, there were exactly 3 teeth. Chapter 20. Unlike Queen Visenya, Queen Rhaenys, another wife of Aegon the Conqueror, has a more lively temperament and prefers to fly on dragons. In the quiet bachelor's room, the old bachelor's voice was calm and steady, while the 3 boys sitting next to each other at the small table listened intently. Queen Rhaenys loves art, music, and poetry, and she also has a kind heart. She once proposed with her husband to abolish the custom of robbing women as salt concubines in the Iron Islands, and she also personally formulated the 6 laws that we still use today. In principle, she still. What is the 6 down principle? Fatty, who was lying on the small table, raised his hand to interrupt what the old man was saying. The fat boy from the Ismond family hates studying very much, but because of his fight with Dondarrion yesterday, he was punished by having to come to listen to the old maester's history class on time for the next half month. However, this fat man obviously would not sit here and listen carefully. Every time a topic worth asking came up in the bachelor's mouth, he would ask questions loudly, as if he really didn't understand. Normal people will definitely become more and more annoyed. Pang Dun's little calculations were going on in his mind, but unfortunately the old bachelor didn't take advantage of this. He even used the other party's questions to teach him indirectly. Renly, do you know the answer to this question? The old man turned to look at the black-haired boy. The principle of 6 lashes is a legal provision. Queen Rhaenys stipulated that if a wife betrays her husband and commits adultery with others, she can only be whipped no more than 6 times, and the wooden stick used must not be thicker than her thumb. Renly on the side answered, and without waiting for the other party to ask another question, he asked and answered his own question, why 6 blows, not 7 or 8 or 9? This is because of the 7 gods we believe in. At this moment, Renly looked as serious as the thin Dondarrion next to him, and spoke slowly, but most of his mind was not on this issue, but on the incident yesterday. Since he left the historical copy, the dentures that originally existed have turned into a pile of powder. Renly regretted this because he still didn't understand what the dentures were. It wasn't until yesterday's cremation that he seemed to get a clue. Yet this is something that cannot really be determined. Renly wasn't sure that the 3 false teeth were the fool's lost teeth. He had no way of knowing why they were teeth and not something else, and he wasn't sure whether he would ever find something like that again. If those teeth really belong to Rigoletto, then why are his teeth so special? If not, what exactly is the origin of dentures? What is the connection with the golden finger on oneself? Many questions bothered Renly, making him unable to concentrate on the lecture. However, because Pang Dun was there to attract attention, the old man didn't notice anything unusual about him today. He didn't say a word to him specifically until the end of the class. It's almost your 5th name day, Renly, so maybe we should think about a gift for you. Thank you, Master Crescent, but I think anything but kippers would be good. The black-haired boy shrugged, then slid off the stool and walked out of the room. The maester's chamber was close to the top of the tower, but the child's body concealed a vast energy. He first went back to his room to get something, and then hurried downstairs. When he finally arrived at the first-floor lobby at the bottom of the tower, he was still breathing evenly. Behind them, the shouts and running sounds of 2 other boys could be heard diagonally above the tunnel of the building. They thought Renly came down to go out to play, but when they arrived, what they saw was that Renly ran to a shelf table in the corner of the hall. He sat down in front of him, facing a strange brown-haired middle-aged man. Fatty, who was hiding at the top of the stairs, looked at the man curiously, then turned to look at his companions behind him. I thought his name was Davos. Onion Davos, pickled fish Davos. Little Bamboo Berry nodded like an adult. He is a smuggler, but he brought food, so we have to be grateful to him. I don't like kippers. Pang Dun wrinkled his nose subconsciously when he heard this, but then he muttered in confusion. What does Renly want from him? The smuggler Davos they called was also very curious about this issue, so when a servant informed him yesterday that Master Renly of Storm's End wanted to see him, he immediately agreed and came as promised. But what the other person said made him confused. You mean, you have a way to get food, but you need my help? Davos repeated hesitantly, looking at the little kid sitting opposite who was trying to straighten his back. Yes, Sir Davos. Renly nodded seriously. At this time, he was wearing a white satin shirt with gold-trimmed cuffs and a sleeveless calfskin tight-fitting jacket. He was sitting opposite the smuggler. The gold-backed crown stag embroidered on his chest looked extremely conspicuous. I am no knight, Lord Renly. Then I'm not an adult either. The boy said as he spread his palms and gestured to his little hands. You're destined to grow up, kid. Davos was amused by his actions and felt much more relaxed. And what the other party said next made him a little bit dumbfounded. If you do this for me, I believe you are destined to be a knight, too. The boy looked serious, but his childish appearance made it difficult for Davos to be serious, so he just smiled and asked, Okay, kid, what do you want me to do? Go catch crows in the Godwood. Recently, someone in the castle did suggest trying to find food in the ancient woods. In fact, some servants and soldiers in the city have already gone to peel the bark to eat, and the wild birds there naturally became the target of these hungry eaters. I want you to take your fishing tools and your boat, leave Storm's End from the cave port, and then find a place where fish live, and sprinkle a handful of special powder into the sea water. Renly said, You will know what to do next. There is a gap space at the root of the towering rock where Storm's End is located. It is a private port built by the ancient Storm Kings. The smugglers arrived at the castle from there before. But the sea water there is not deep, and it is full of rocks. Small boats cannot enter unless it is high tide. Renly does not expect there will be many fish there, otherwise, he would not need to find the person in front of him. Unfortunately, although Davos listened carefully, he still thought that what was happening in front of him was just a farce, or a child's wild and irrelevant plan. I hope I can help you, but kid, this matter. He seemed to be hesitating about how to say it so as not to discourage the child's enthusiasm, and finally he thought of a perfect excuse. Your second brother, Lord Stannis, will not allow me to leave Storm's End. Why not? The boy asked. If I do this, I will become a deserter, and no one will believe that I am working for you. The smuggler's answer makes sense. But Renly did not give up his plan. The main reason why he asked the smuggler to do this was that the other party was not from Storm's End, or not yet. And if Renly asked someone else, there was no need to think about it, the news would be directly passed to Stannis's ears, and even known to everyone. This represents some things that are difficult to predict. There may be good, but there will definitely be bad. So he insisted, as far as I know, you are not from Storm's End. I am not from here, but I know the situation here. If I leave the city, your brother will consider whether I will go to his enemies and tell them the information here. I believe our enemies have known the situation of Storm's End for a long time. Renly was not fooled by the other party's words. I also believe that many people outside know it. Otherwise, why would you transport food here? After saying that, he spoke again without waiting for the other party to answer. You may say that the situation is different now. I have to say that it is worse now than before, but when those people outside hear that we are about to eat human flesh, do you think they will continue to wait happily, or rush to attack? This Davos was a little surprised by the intelligence of the child in front of him, but he was interrupted by the other party before he said it. Besides, I don't think you will go to the enemy. The boy said, showing a smile that only he understood. If a normal person said this, the smuggler might be moved, but the one in front of him was a child under 5 years old. Although the child looked very smart, his words sounded more like a child's simple and beautiful thoughts. So Davos just coughed dryly. Even if Lord Stannis allowed me to leave the city, Redwine's fleet would always be watching us outside the city. I don't think they would give me a chance to go fishing. Ahem, child, you asked me to go fishing, right? I asked you to save yourself. Renly changed the subject. There are 7 prisoners in the dungeon now, 2 of whom are suffering from grayscale disease. You may be able to guess the choice we face when the food runs out. So have you ever thought about what will happen when those prisoners are eaten? When they are eaten, what will we do next? Davos was stunned. Obviously, he had never thought that a child could say such cruel words, let alone the meaning of the boy's words. Who is most likely to be abandoned here? Is it the native people, or? Davos's throat rolled when he heard it. I believe Lord Stannis will not do that. If you think you know him better than I do, you can believe that. Renly shrugged and said indifferently, I think he will defend the castle to the death. Do you know what this word means? Seeing the other party's face change, Renly supported the rough wooden table with one hand, leaned forward with his upper body, and lowered his voice. Think about the purpose of your coming to Storm's End, Davos. Risking the risk of being beheaded to break through the blockade of those fleets at sea and send a ship of food when we are in the most difficult time. What is the purpose? Is it to let us know how bad your meat tastes? Well, maybe Stannis won't do this, then what about you, will you be willing to wait like this? Your ship capsized, otherwise you might get a reward you deserve, but unfortunately, for now, your help is not important to us at all. I am a smuggler, and I have been taking risks all my life. Experience tells me that not every adventure can be rewarded. Davos answered instinctively, with a vigilant voice. Although this is the biggest risk I have taken, I will not be disappointed. That's right, I won't. He said it with certainty, but his tone had already exposed some of his true emotions, so Renly did not respond to the other party's words after hearing it, but picked up something on the stool and put it on the table. It was a sealed iron box, which looked grey and inconspicuous in the dim light. Now, the chance to remedy is at your fingertips. Grab it, your adventure will be worth it. Believe me, this thing is particularly effective for fish. If you don't believe it, he said, and put a porcelain cup that he had always held in his other hand next to the iron can. I'll give you a small fish, try it yourself. I haven't. Looking at the 2 things pushed in front of him, the smuggler said in surprise, and there are many problems with this. Go back and think about it carefully, and then try it seriously. If you still don't want to, then return the things to me, you should be able to find out where I live. Renly slid down the bench while admonishing. This powder is very precious. Although I still have a lot, you'd better be careful when using it. Also, don't forget this fish. You know that it is not easy to get this fish for Storm's End now. He left a last word. If you are willing to work hard, then these things are yours, no matter how you think of the source. The credit is also yours, remember to keep it secret. The boy turned and left after saying that. Davos' lips trembled at this, but until the short figure disappeared at the stairs, he didn't think about what he should say. After being stunned for a while, he finally raised his hand to pick up the wooden wine cup on the table, raised his head and drank the brown beer inside, and then cursed in a low voice. 7 layers of hell, are the children of the nobles so precocious?